For my entire childhood, my family called me the ugly one. My sister was the pretty one. My brother was the smart one. At our high society family reunion, my aunt introduced me to a stranger by saying, "This is the one we do not talk about." I looked at my aunt, then looked at the stranger. The stranger pulled out a business card and said, "Actually, I am here because of her. She is my boss. My name is Jocelyn. I am 33 years old and the founder and CEO of Vanguard Heritage Holdings. Before I tell you how I dismantled my family toxic empire in a single evening, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth." The crystal chandeliers of the Heritage Club in downtown Chicago cast a warm golden glow over the private dining room. It was the kind of establishment that prided itself on exclusivity, requiring a membership fee that could buy a small house in the suburbs. My Aunt Brenda had just delivered her cruel introduction, a smug smile plastered across her perfectly lifted face. She expected me to shrink away in shame, just like I did when I was a teenager. She expected me to apologize for breathing the same air as the rest of my flawless relatives. Instead, the woman standing next to me took a deliberate step forward. Carmen wore a tailored charcoal suit that screamed absolute authority. She did not raise her voice, but her tone cut through the ambient jazz music like a blade. "I am the chief legal counsel for Vanguard Heritage Holdings," Carmen stated coldly, looking down at my Aunt Brenda. "And I am here escorting my boss Jocelyn." The entire private dining room fell dead silent. The clinking of silver forks against fine china ceased immediately. My mother Patricia shoved her chair back so violently it tipped over and hit the floor with a loud thud. She aggressively pushed past Carmen, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. Her face was contorted with a mixture of rage and profound embarrassment. "Are you out of your mind?" Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with venom. "You are a broke, ugly college dropout playing dress-up to embarrass us in front of our guests. You are drowning in debt and you dragged some hired actor here to make yourself look important. Get out of my sight before I call security." I did not flinch. I simply looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a stain on her perfect canvas. Before I could respond, my brother Nathaniel strutted over. Nathaniel was the golden boy, the supposed financial genius of the family who had taken over my father's real estate development firm. He wore a custom Italian suit and a smirk that mirrored my mother's exact expression of disdain. Nathaniel scoffed loudly, reaching into his breast pocket. He pulled out the leather-bound receipt folder for the country club dinner and threw it aggressively at my chest. The folder hit me and fell to the floor, but I did not break eye contact with him. "You want to play the big shot? CEO," Nathaniel sneered, taking a sip of his scotch. "Then prove you are not a fraud. Pay the bill. It is $15,000. Consider it the entry fee for breathing the same air as us today. Today is supposed to be a celebration of my company securing a massive bailout package. Do not pollute the room with your pathetic lies. Pay the bill or I will personally have the guards drag you out." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive alcohol and unearned arrogance. "Or are you going to cry like that night when you were 18? You remember that night, right, Jocelyn? The night Mom and Dad threw you out into the freezing snow with nothing but a black garbage bag full of your cheap clothes. You begged us for bus money. You had nothing then, and you have nothing now. You are exactly what you have always been. A complete and utter failure." The memory of that freezing night in Chicago flashed through my mind. The biting cold, the tears freezing on my cheeks, the absolute terror of being abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me. They had cut me off without a penny because I refused to be their quiet, obedient scapegoat anymore. They thought destroying me would be easy. They had no idea that throwing me into the cold only taught me how to survive the winter. I remained icy calm. I did not bend down to pick up the folder. Instead, I reached into my designer handbag and smoothly pulled out a heavy metal black corporate card. I held it out between two fingers. "Waiter," I called out, my voice steady and commanding. "Process the payment for my brother. It seems he cannot afford to feed his own guests." A waiter hesitantly approached to take the card, But before he could reach me, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open. The country club general manager, a man who usually only interacted with billionaires and politicians, rushed into the room. He was sweating profusely and completely ignored Nathaniel. The manager hurried over to me, bypassing my entire shocked family. He did not reach for the credit card. Instead, he bowed deeply, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "Miss Jocelyn," he stammered, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I apologize for the disruption. The escrow just cleared 10 minutes ago. I want to be the first to formally welcome you. Your acquisition paperwork is complete. We are entirely at your service." Nathaniel dropped his glass of scotch. The crystal shattered against the hardwood floor, sending amber liquid splashing across his expensive leather shoes. "What acquisition?" Nathaniel demanded, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "What are you talking about?" The manager stood up straight and looked at my brother with a mixture of pity and strict professionalism. He turned back to me, waiting for my permission to speak. I gave him a slight nod. "Sir," the manager said, clearing his throat, "the black card will not be necessary for the dining bill. Miss Jocelyn does not need to pay for dinner because she officially purchased the Heritage Club this morning. She owns the building, the grounds, and everything in it. She is the new chairman of the board." The silence that followed the manager announcement was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when a fundamental law of the universe is suddenly broken in front of an arrogant audience. My family stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. The reality of the situation was hitting them, but their deeply ingrained superiority complexes refused to let them process the truth. My sister Isabella broke the silence with a shrill, screeching laugh. Isabella was the undisputed beauty queen of the family, a luxury lifestyle influencer who spent her days unboxing designer bags on camera. She stomped forward, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the wood floor. "You expect us to believe this?" Isabella yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the manager. "My sister is a broke loser. She probably slept with some 80-year-old billionaire to get access to his bank accounts. There is no way a dropout like her could buy a $50 million country club on her own. She is lying. You are all lying." Isabella's face was red with fury. She could not handle the idea that the ugly duckling of the family, the sister she had spent her entire life mocking and stealing from, had achieved a level of wealth she could only dream of. I remembered how Isabella used to steal my savings from my piggy bank to buy makeup. I remembered how she paraded around in custom gowns paid for by our parents while I wore her oversized hand-me-downs. Before Isabella could hurl another insult, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward from the shadows of the room. It was Kendrick. Kendrick was Isabella's African-American husband and arguably the only person in this room with actual intelligence. He was a brilliant risk assessment analyst who had worked his way up from nothing. My family hated him. They tolerated his presence only because Isabella threw a tantrum to marry him, but they subjected him to endless passive-aggressive racism and classism, making sure he knew he would never truly belong to their old money world. Kendrick ignored his wife, hysterical shouting. His sharp eyes were locked onto the small silver pin fastened to the lapel of Carmen's suit jacket. It was a stylized falcon, the discreet corporate logo of Vanguard Heritage Holdings. Kendrick's face went completely pale. He walked past Isabella and stood directly in front of Nathaniel. "Nathaniel," Kendrick said, his voice dangerously low and urgent. "You need to stop talking right now. You need to listen to me. Vanguard Heritage Holdings. That is the anonymous private equity fund that bought up all of your toxic commercial real estate loans last month. They own 80% of your corporate debt." Nathaniel's face contorted into an ugly sneer. He shoved Kendrick backward, dismissing him completely. "Shut your mouth, you clueless diversity hire!" Nathaniel spat, the racial undertone dripping from his words. "You do not know anything about my business. You are just a glorified accountant. My company is fine. I am securing a $100 million bailout tomorrow morning from a massive conglomerate." Nathaniel turned his back on Kendrick, completely disregarding the life-saving warning his brother-in-law had just tried to give him. He marched back to the dining table and snatched a thick manila envelope. He marched right up to me and slammed a property transfer contract onto the table in front of me. I do not care whose bed you are warming to get this fake country club status, Nathaniel snarled. You are going to sign this right now. It is a transfer deed for your 5% share of grandfather historic estate. I need total ownership of the land to use as final collateral for my bailout tomorrow. You have held that useless 5% hostage for too long. Sign it over to me right now, Jocelyn. Sign it, and I will let you walk out of here without calling the police for whatever scam you are pulling. The absolute audacity of my brother was breathtaking. He was standing on the edge of a financial cliff, and instead of backing away, he was demanding I hand him a parachute, while simultaneously insulting me. Grandfather Estate was a sprawling historic property that my family had been trying to bulldoze for years to build cheap commercial strip malls. I had held on to my tiny 5% share specifically to prevent them from legally demolishing the historic site. Kendrick tried to intervene again. Nathaniel, if she is connected to Vanguard, you cannot give her that deed. It is a trap. If you transfer assets while holding Vanguard debt without their authorization, I said shut up. Kendrick Nathaniel roared, spittle flying from his lips. He slammed a pen down on top of the contract. Sign it, Jocelyn. You owe this family for keeping you alive for 18 years. I looked at the pen, then looked at Nathaniel's sweating, desperate face. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply picked up the pen. Isabella laughed triumphantly from the background. That is right. Sign it, you ugly coward. You always fold when Nathaniel yells at you. I uncapped the pen and smoothly signed my name on the transfer deed. Nathaniel let out a massive sigh of relief, a greedy smile spreading across his face. He reached out to snatch the paper away, but Carmen stepped forward faster than lightning. She placed her hand firmly over the document. Not so fast, Carmen said, her voice echoing with legal authority. A signature requires an official seal to be legally binding in corporate property transfers. I reached into my handbag one more time. I did not pull out a standard notary stamp. I pulled out a heavy brass corporate embosser. I placed it over my signature and pressed down firmly. The sharp crunch of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I slid the document toward Nathaniel. He picked it up and stared at the raised seal. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he read the embossed words. Vanguard Heritage Holdings, LLC, Office of the Chief Executive Officer. I smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. Thank you for the collateral, Nathaniel, I said softly. By officially attempting to transfer a contested family asset to a corporate entity while your firm is currently holding default status debt, you have legally triggered the hostile review clause hidden in Section 4 of your loan agreements. Nathaniel began to shake uncontrollably. What does that mean? He whispered, his arrogance completely evaporating. Kendrick answered from behind him, his voice filled with grim finality. It means you just breached your contract, Nathaniel. She does not just own your debt anymore. She just legally froze every single asset your company has. You are completely bankrupt. Isabella shattered the silence. She slammed her manicured hands onto the dining table, knocking over a water goblet. Water spilled across the white tablecloth, soaking Nathaniel's suit pants, but Isabella did not care. Her face morphed into a mask of pure rage. She pointed her finger right at my face. You think you are so smart, Jocelyn, Isabella shrieked. You think just because you stamped a piece of paper you can walk in here and ruin our lives? You are nothing. You are 33 years old, single, and pathetically alone. Look at you. You are wearing a stiff corporate suit, trying to play the part of a successful woman, but underneath it all, you are still just the ugly duckling of this family. She paced back and forth, trying to reassert her dominance. You have always been jealous of me, Isabella spat. Ever since we were kids, you hated me because Mom and Dad bought me custom dresses from boutiques in Paris, while you were stuck wearing my oversized hand-me-downs. You looked like a garbage bag tied with a string then, and you look like one now. I have a perfect marriage. I have millions of followers who adore my luxury lifestyle. Brands pay me thousands of dollars just to hold their products on camera. I am an icon. You have a fake title and a desperate need for attention. You will never be on my level. I gave Carmen a slow, deliberate nod. Carmen stepped forward, unlatching her leather briefcase with a sharp snap that made Isabella stop pacing. Carmen pulled out a thick red folder and dropped it right onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud, demanding everyone attention. "Those are interesting claims regarding your influencer career," Isabella Carmen said. "However, Vanguard Heritage Holdings conducts thorough forensic audits on all entities connected to the debt portfolios we acquire. We audited the internal risk assessment logs regarding your brother company. What we found was an absolute masterpiece of financial fraud." Isabella's face drained of color. She stared at the red folder as if it were a live grenade. Nathaniel looked frantically between his sister and the folder, his panic rising by the second. "Your luxury brand deals do not exist," Carmen stated clearly. "We contacted those companies directly. You pay them retail price for the clothes and then pretend you are sponsored to impress strangers on the internet. But the real issue is not your fake social media life. The real issue is how you fund it. You have been funneling money out of Nathaniel Commercial Real Estate Firm through phantom shell companies for the past 4 years. You embezzled over $3 million from your own brother to pay for your private jets, your designer bags, and your online existence." Nathaniel spun around to face his sister in raw disbelief. "You stole from the company," he roared, grabbing the table. "You stole $3 million while I was laying off half my staff to avoid bankruptcy. You are the reason we defaulted on our commercial loans. You bled my company dry." "It is a lie," Isabella screamed, her voice cracking as she took a desperate step backward away from her furious brother. "She is making it up to tear us apart. It is a forged document. Kendrick, tell them it is a lie. Tell them her lawyer fabricated these financial statements. You are a risk assessment expert. You know my accounts better than anyone else. You know I would never do something like this. Defend me against these horrible accusations." Isabella turned to her husband, her eyes wide with desperate pleading. She expected Kendrick to step in front of her to shield her from the consequences of her own actions, just like he always did. She expected the African-American man she and her entire family constantly belittled to save her from the blazing fire she started. She reached out to grab his arm, expecting absolute obedience and unwavering loyalty. Kendrick did not move to protect her. He smoothly stepped out of her reach, leaving her grasping at empty air. He stood perfectly still, his posture rigid and his expression colder than ice. He had endured years of microaggressions, insults, and blatant disrespect from this family. He was done being their shield. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone, holding it up so the screen illuminated his face in the dim lighting of the dining room. "I cannot defend you," Isabella Kendrick said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I simply cannot defend you because Carmen did not fabricate a single page in that red folder. I know those financial numbers are totally accurate. I know the shell companies are real. I know exactly how much capital you stole from your brother failing firm to fund your delusions of grandeur." Isabella shook her head, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine fear as the walls closed in around her. "Because I am the one who compiled the embezzlement report," Kendrick stated firmly, locking eyes with his wife. "I found the discrepancies in Nathaniel corporate ledgers 6 months ago. I tracked the missing funds directly to your hidden offshore accounts. I handed the entire file over to Vanguard during their initial acquisition audit. And right before I walked into this dining room tonight, I logged into our joint banking portal and permanently froze every single one of your credit cards. You have absolutely nothing left to your name anymore, not even a single cent. Your entire lavish lifestyle is a complete fraud, and your financial independence is totally gone. I will not let you drag me down with your rapidly sinking ship, Isabella. The game is finally over for you, and there is absolutely no one left in this room who will ever pay your debts." Isabella collapsed into a tufted leather chair, gasping for air as the reality of her financial ruin settled in. The room was thick with tension, but it was my mother, Patricia, who broke the silence. Seeing her golden children completely dismantled in a matter of minutes pushed her into a frantic state of survival. Patricia had spent her entire life manipulating every narrative to ensure she was always the martyr or the hero. This moment was no different. She could not attack my finances, so she attacked my conscience. Patricia pressed a hand to her chest and let out a dramatic, wounded sob. She stumbled forward, placing herself between me and my siblings, acting as a human shield against the truth. "Jocelyn, how can you do this to your own flesh and blood?" Patricia wailed, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Have you completely lost your mind? After everything I have sacrificed for you? After I gave you life and put a roof over your head? You come into this establishment and attack your brother and sister. You are a sick, ungrateful monster. You are tearing this family apart out of pure spite." I watched the fake tears stream down my perfectly powdered cheeks. It was the same flawless performance she used whenever my father caught her overspending, or whenever a teacher called to report Isabella bullying another student. She twisted the reality of the room, trying to make me the aggressor and them the helpless victims. "Sacrifices," I repeated, letting the word hang in the silent room. "You mean the sacrifices like turning a blind eye when Nathaniel stole my high school science project to win a state competition? Or the sacrifice of forcing me to sleep in the unheated attic room so Isabella could have a walk-in closet for her designer shoes?" Patricia's face hardened, her sorrow instantly evaporating into venomous rage. "I clothed you," Patricia hissed, taking a threatening step toward me. "I fed you. I kept you off the streets when you were a miserable, socially awkward child who brought nothing but embarrassment to the Blackwell name. You owe me, Jocelyn. If you have all this money now, you owe me for every single meal you ate in my house. You owe me for the water you drank and the electricity you used. I want a check for 18 years of child-rearing before you take another breath in my presence." The sheer audacity of her demand was staggering, but I had anticipated this exact reaction. My mother viewed children as investments, and I was the stock she thought had plummeted. She wanted me to feel guilty for simply existing. "I owe you nothing," I stated calmly. "In fact, you owe me." Patricia let out a loud, abrasive laugh, tossing her head back. "I owe you? For what?" I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and tapped the screen. As the new owner of the Heritage Club, I had full administrative access to the building integrated audio-visual system. I synced my device to the overhead speakers that were currently playing soft ambient jazz. I tapped a button to mute the music and selected an audio file I had been saving for 8 long years. I had recovered the file from an old family computer hard drive just before they kicked me out. "Let us clear the ledger right now," I said, looking my mother dead in the eyes. I hit play. Suddenly, Patricia's shrill, panicked voice boomed from the hidden surround sound speakers above us, filling the entire private dining room. The recording began mid-sentence. "I do not care what the bank manager says, Richard. You have to sign the authorization forms today. Isabella needs this rhinoplasty and the lip fillers before rush week at the sorority, or her life will be completely ruined. Just take the money out of Jocelyn College Trust Fund." My father's voice filtered through the speakers, sounding tired and annoyed. "We cannot just empty Jocelyn account, Patricia. That money was left specifically by my mother for her tuition." Patricia's voice on this recording grew vicious. "Who cares about Jocelyn tuition? Look at her, Richard. She is plain and completely uncharismatic. A degree is not going to fix her face. Isabella is our ticket to a high society marriage, and she needs to look flawless. Drain the ugly duckling account. She can go to community college and take out loans like the rest of the working class. Transfer the $80,000 right now, or I swear I will make your life a living hell." The audio file ended with the sharp click of a disconnected line. The silence in the dining room returned, but this time it was suffocating. The other wealthy patrons sitting at the adjacent tables were openly staring, their mouths slightly ajar. The elite members of Chicago high society, the very people my mother spent her entire life trying to impress, had just heard her admit to committing wire fraud and grand theft against her own teenage daughter to fund cosmetic surgery. Patricia stood frozen. Her jaw trembled, and her eyes darted frantically around the room, watching her carefully constructed social reputation burn to absolute ash. The wealthy women she played tennis with were whispering behind their hands, casting disgusted looks in her direction. Her gaslighting was completely dismantled by her own recorded words. $80,000 stolen when I was 17 years old, I said, breaking the silence. Adjusted for market growth and compounding interest over the last decade and a half, that stolen trust fund would be worth over $400,000 today. You did not just kick me out in the snow with a garbage bag, Patricia. You robbed me blind to finance Isabella fake face and then called me a burden. The public exposure snapped whatever thin thread of sanity Patricia had left. The realization that she could no longer twist the narrative that her cruelty was now undeniable public knowledge drove her into a blind, feral rage. She could not argue with the facts, so she resorted to the only tactic she had left. "You wretched little lying brat!" Patricia screamed. She lunged across the distance between us, raising her hand high in the air. Her diamond rings flashed under the chandelier light as she swung her arm, aiming a vicious open-handed slap directly at my face. She wanted to physically strike me down to put the scapegoat back in her place through sheer violence. I did not blink. I did not step back. Before her hand could make contact, a strong, muscular arm shot out from my right side. Kendrick moved with terrifying speed. He intercepted Patricia's wrist mid-air, his large hand closing around her forearm like a steel vice. The impact halted her momentum completely, leaving her suspended and struggling against his iron grip. Patricia gasped in shock, trying to wrench her arm free, but Kendrick did not budge an inch. He towered over my mother, his expression devoid of any respect or submission. "Let go of me, you insolent thug!" Patricia shrieked, struggling against his hold. Kendrick leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, menacing octave that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "If you ever attempt to lay a hand on her again, Patricia, I will not just have you escorted off the premises." Kendrick warned, his eyes blazing with years of repressed anger. "I will personally drag you to the police precinct and press formal assault charges against you. You are not untouchable anymore. You are just a common thief who got caught. Now step back before I make this night even worse for you." Kendrick released Patricia's wrist with a forceful shove that sent her stumbling backward into her heavy dining chair. She collapsed into the upholstered seat, gasping for air and clutching her arm. The physical confrontation finally shattered the stoic facade of the man sitting at the head of the table. Richard, my father, had spent the entire evening watching his wife and golden children be systematically dismantled. He had remained silent, observing the chaos with the cold, calculating eyes of a real estate tycoon who was used to letting his subordinates take the first wave of fire. But seeing his wife physically handled by a man he deeply despised was the final strike to his massive ego. Richard stood up. The heavy wooden legs of his chair screeched against the polished hardwood floor, cutting through the heavy silence of the private dining room. He was a tall, imposing man who had spent 40 years using his physical size and booming voice to intimidate local politicians and rival developers. He buttoned his bespoke suit jacket and leveled a glare at Kendrick that was laced with decades of unchecked prejudice and aristocratic entitlement. "You will never step foot in one of my properties again," Richard growled, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "You are done in this family, Kendrick. I will personally see to it that your career in Chicago is over. You will be blacklisted from every financial firm in the Midwest." Kendrick did not flinch. He simply straightened his cuffs and held Richard's gaze with unwavering calm. "Your threats are as empty as your bank accounts, Richard." Richard's face flushed a deep mottled crimson, but he refused to engage further with his son-in-law. Instead, he turned his full, towering wrath onto me. He marched around the edge of the dining table, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the shards of broken crystal. He stopped mere inches from where I stood, attempting to use his height to force me to look up at him. I held my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely blank. "You think this little theatrical display changes anything?" Jocelyn Richard demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think coming in here with a stolen corporate credit card and a hired lawyer gives you power over me? I built this family empire from the ground up. I dictate who wins and who loses. You are going to pick up your phone call, whatever second-rate bank you are using, and unfreeze Nathaniel accounts this instant. If you do not, I will utterly destroy you." I tilted my head slightly, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Richard?" He pointed a thick finger right at my face. I will legally disown you. I will call my estate attorneys tonight and have you permanently excised from the Blackwell Family Trust. I will strike your name from the lineage. I will legally ensure that every record of your existence in this family is completely expunged. You will not receive a single penny of inheritance. You will be a ghost. You will go back to being the miserable little nobody we threw out into the snow 15 years ago. I let out a soft, humorless chuckle. You are threatening to take away an inheritance you already allowed your wife to steal. You are a terrible negotiator. Richard slammed his fist onto the dining table, rattling the remaining silverware. I told you 15 years ago when you sat in my study begging for a place in my company. I told you then that business is a man world. It requires a killer instinct, a level of ruthlessness that you simply do not possess. You were always too soft, too emotional. You spent your childhood reading about architectural preservation and crying over old buildings while Nathaniel was learning how to leverage debt and crush competitors. He paced a tight circle around me, sneering as he recounted his twisted version of our family history. That is why I chose him. Richard boasted, gesturing wildly to where Nathaniel sat, sweating and panicked. I chose the son who understood power. I groomed him to inherit an empire while you were busy playing with historical fantasies. You never had the intellect or the spine to sit in my boardroom, Jocelyn. You are a weak, overly sensitive girl who could not handle the pressure of real business. I looked at Nathaniel, who was currently shivering in his ruined suit, entirely bankrupted by the very sister his father was calling weak. Nathaniel avoided my gaze, staring fixedly at his expensive shoes. Your chosen successor just signed away his entire company because he did not bother to read the fine print, I pointed out calmly. That killer instinct seems to be lacking. Richard waved his hand dismissively, entirely unfazed by Nathaniel's catastrophic failure. He let out a booming, arrogant laugh that filled the room. He walked back to his seat and casually picked up his wineglass, inspecting the red liquid inside. You honestly think I care about Nathaniel's frozen accounts? Richard asked, a smug, triumphant smile stretching across his face. You think you have cornered me because you bought this pathetic country club and found a legal loophole to freeze a few $1,000,000? You have absolutely no idea what is actually happening. You are playing checkers while I am playing chess. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his wine, savoring the moment. He wanted to watch my face fall. He wanted to see me crumble under the weight of his ultimate victory. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, my commercial development firm is being fully acquired. Richard announced, his chest puffing out with supreme arrogance. A massive international conglomerate based out of New York has already signed the letters of intent. They are buying us out completely, $100 million in pure, untraceable liquid cash. The wire transfer is already queued and waiting for the market to open. Patricia suddenly perked up, her tear-stained face brightening with greedy salvation. Nathaniel lifted his head, a desperate spark of hope returning to his eyes. Isabella stopped crying and sat up straight. The magic number had instantly resurrected their toxic superiority. $100 million. Richard repeated, enunciating every single syllable. With that kind of capital, I can bury you in litigation until you are 80 years old. I will hire an army of lawyers to drag you through federal court. I will bankrupt whatever little heritage fund you are playing with. I will take your country club, your company, and your freedom. You brought a knife to a gunfight, Jocelyn, and tomorrow morning, I am dropping a nuclear bomb on your entire life. I did not gasp. I did not step back. I simply looked at my father and felt a deep, profound pity for the arrogant dinosaur standing in front of me. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a sharp, melodic sound echoed through the room. Carmen, my impeccably dressed legal counsel, threw her head back and laughed out loud. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a rich, booming laugh of pure corporate amusement. Richard's face darkened with furious confusion. What is so funny, you hired suit? He snapped. Carmen did not answer him immediately. She calmly unbuttoned her tailored blazer and reached into the interior breast pocket. She pulled out a thick, premium matte black business card. She walked forward, her heels clicking against the floor, and stood directly across the table from my father. She tossed the card onto the mahogany surface. It slid across the polished wood, gliding right through the puddle of spilled water, and came to a dead stop exactly at Richard's fingertips. "I suggest you take a closer look at your savior," Richard Carmen said, a sharp, predatory grin on her face. Richard glared at Carmen, then looked down at the table. He picked up the heavy card. His eyes scanned the embossed silver lettering. I watched his breathing stop. I watched the triumphant color completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, sickly ghost. His hands began to shake so violently the card fluttered in his grip. He read the name of the massive international conglomerate, Vanguard Heritage Holdings. Then his eyes dropped to the second line. He read the name of the chief executive officer who possessed the sole authorization to release the $100 million wire transfer tomorrow morning. The name on the card was Jocelyn. The silence in the dining room stretched so tight it felt like the crystal chandeliers might shatter from the pressure. Nathaniel snatched the matte black business card right out of our father's trembling hands. His eyes darted back and forth across the embossed silver lettering. He read my name over and over again, as if staring at it long enough would somehow change the ink into a different reality. "You are the CEO of Vanguard Heritage Holdings." Nathaniel choked out the words, scraping against his throat like broken glass. "You are the conglomerate buying us out tomorrow morning." I did not nod. I did not smile. I just let him drown in his own realization. "It is a trap!" Nathaniel suddenly screamed, backing away from the table and bumping into a waiter who quickly scrambled out of the way. "The entire bailout package, the $100 million, it was never real. You set us up. You lured us into signing those letters of intent so we would expose our financial liabilities to you." Carmen stepped forward, her posture immaculate. "The letters of intent were absolutely real, Nathaniel. Vanguard Heritage Holdings was fully prepared to acquire your commercial development firm at a highly competitive market rate. However, those agreements contained standard morality and fraud clauses. Given that your firm is currently hemorrhaging money to fund your sister's fake luxury lifestyle, and you just attempted to illegally coerce my client into signing over protected historical assets, the acquisition is officially terminated." Nathaniel's face shifted from pale ghost to a dangerous deep shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the golden boy, the untouchable financial genius who could spin straw into gold, while his ugly duckling sister wallowed in the mud. He had spent his entire life taking credit for my ideas. When we were in our early 20s, Nathaniel stole my detailed business proposal for a boutique hotel renovation and presented it to our father board of directors as his own original concept. He secured his first major promotion with my stolen work. When I confronted him, he laughed in my face and told me that execution is all that matters, and girls like me were too weak to execute anything. He built his entire career on the foundation of my stolen labor. Now he was watching that exact foundation crumble beneath his expensive Italian loafers. "You think you have beaten me?" Nathaniel roared, pacing like a caged animal. "You think freezing my assets and pulling your fake little bailout destroys me? I am Nathaniel Blackwell. I have financial connections you cannot even comprehend. I play golf with the men who own this city. I do not need your corporate trap money to survive." He frantically dug his hands into his suit pockets and ripped out his smartphone. His fingers were shaking so violently he dropped his phone on the table, snatched it back up, and aggressively stabbed at the screen. "I have a primary private lender," Nathaniel bragged, his voice echoing with desperate manic energy. "A shadow investor who operates strictly off the books. He provides emergency bridge loans for high-net-worth clients. I will get a $10 million wire transfer right now. I will use it to bypass your ridiculous asset freeze, bypass your hostile review clause, and keep my commercial properties afloat until I find a real buyer." "You are nothing, Jocelyn. You are just a vindictive little girl playing a game you do not understand." Isabella clapped her hands together from her seat, her tear-streaked face lighting up with toxic hope. "Yes, Nathaniel, crush her," Isabella cheered. "Show this ungrateful failure who actually runs this family." Nathaniel held the phone to his ear, his eyes locked onto mine with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He paced back and forth, waiting for the connection to establish. Pick up the phone, Marcus Nathaniel muttered under his breath. Come on, pick up the damn phone. I stood perfectly still, watching my brother unravel. For years I had endured his arrogant lectures at every Thanksgiving dinner. I had sat silently while he mocked my small apartment, my lack of a husband, and my supposedly dead-end career in historic preservation. He had constantly reminded me that I was a financial liability to the Blackwell name. Now he was begging a shadow lender for a lifeline because his own unchecked greed had pushed his company to the brink of total annihilation. Marcus Nathaniel suddenly barked into the receiver, his tone instantly shifting into demanding arrogance. Listen to me very carefully. I need a $10 million bridge loan wired to my secure secondary account immediately. Do not give me any excuses about liquidity. I am good for it. You know I am good for it. The Blackwell name is gold. Wire the funds right now, or I will take my business elsewhere and ruin your lending reputation. He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for his demands to be met. He was the golden son, expecting the world to bow to his command, just like our parents had always taught him. But something strange happened. From deep inside Carmen's sleek leather briefcase, a muffled electronic ringing began to echo. Nathaniel paused, his phone still pressed tightly against his ear. He looked confused as the ringing from Carmen's briefcase perfectly synchronized with the dial tone he was hearing on his end. Carmen calmly unlatched her briefcase. She reached inside and pulled out a simple black cell phone. The screen was glowing brightly, indicating an incoming call. The caller identification displayed on the screen in large, bold letters read, Nathaniel Blackwell. Carmen did not answer it. Instead, she handed the ringing cell phone directly to me. Nathaniel lowered his phone from his ear, his mouth falling open in sheer absolute terror. His brain was desperately trying to process how the private off-the-books number of his shadow investor was currently ringing in my hand. I looked down at the glowing screen, then looked up at my brother's trembling face. I tapped the green button to accept the call and put it on speakerphone. The audio feedback from the two connected phones created a sharp electronic whine in the quiet dining room. Your loan request is denied, Nathaniel, I said, my voice carrying a lethal, icy calm. Nathaniel stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the dining table. How he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. How do you have Marcus' phone? I do not have Marcus' phone, I replied, dropping the device onto the table next to his forged property deed. Marcus works for me. He is a subordinate agent in one of Vanguard's subsidiary lending branches. You thought you were dealing with a shadow investor, but you have been borrowing from my company for the last 6 months to keep your failing empire afloat. I bought your remaining debt 3 days ago. You do not just owe me an apology, Nathaniel. You owe me everything. Nathaniel slammed the phone down onto the table so hard the screen cracked. His chest heaved as he frantically looked around the room, searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. His eyes darted from my perfectly calm expression to Carmen's amused smirk, and finally landed on the tall, imposing figure standing quietly by the door. Kendrick. The realization that Isabella's husband had known about my corporate acquisition the entire time hit Nathaniel like a freight train. He could not physically attack me with Carmen and the country club security standing by, so he directed his explosive rage at the easiest target he could find. This is your fault, you traitor, Nathaniel spat, pointing a shaking finger at his brother-in-law. You are a senior risk analyst. You knew Vanguard was buying my debt. You knew they were setting up this hostile takeover, and you stood there smiling at our dinner table while this ungrateful witch plotted against your own family. Richard stepped forward, backing up his son. His face was a mask of aristocratic disgust. I knew we never should have let you marry into this family, Richard growled, his voice dripping with condescension. I told Patricia from the very beginning that bringing someone from your background into our circle was a massive liability. We gave you a seat at the table, Kendrick. We sponsored your membership to this very club so you could rub shoulders with real wealth. We elevated you from whatever mediocre urban life you were destined for, and this is how you repay us, by stabbing us in the back. The coded language was not subtle. The wealthy white patriarch and his entitled heir were finally saying the quiet part out loud. For years they had used Kendrick as a prop to prove how progressive and modern the Blackwell family was. But behind closed doors, they constantly reminded him that he was an outsider. You were supposed to protect our assets. Richard continued, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. You are supposed to be the financial watchdog. Instead, you let my worthless daughter steal my company right out from under me. You are nothing but an incompetent affirmative action hire who bit the hand that fed him. Kendrick did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He simply reached up and adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, maintaining a posture of absolute unbothered power. He looked at Richard and Nathaniel not with anger, but with profound clinical pity. You did not elevate me, Richard. Kendrick said, his rich voice cutting through the dining room with effortless authority. I graduated at the top of my class from Wharton. I built my career long before I had the misfortune of meeting your daughter. You did not give me a seat at the table. I built my own table, and you invited yourselves over to siphon off my financial advice for free. Kendrick took a slow, deliberate step toward the two men, forcing Nathaniel to instinctively back away. For 7 years, I sat in your drawing rooms and smiled while you made your little passive-aggressive jokes. Kendrick continued, holding Richard's gaze. I listened to you ask me if I felt intimidated by the country club dress code. I listened to Nathaniel ask me to fetch his golf clubs because he pretended to mistake me for the caddy. I watched you both take my risk assessment reports, slap the Blackwell logo on them, and present them to your investors as your own genius strategies. You never saw me as a son-in-law. You saw me as an unpaid consultant and a diversity token to parade around your wealthy friends. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Kendrick held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. And as for protecting your assets, Kendrick said, turning his attention to Nathaniel, I am a risk analyst. My job is to identify toxic liabilities and neutralize them before they destroy the portfolio. The moment I discovered that Isabella was embezzling millions from your commercial firm to buy fake Instagram followers, I realized this entire family was a terminal liability. I did not betray you, Nathaniel. I simply let your own staggering incompetence catch up to you. Kendrick turned his back on the sputtering men and walked over to Isabella. She was still slumped in her leather chair, mascara running down her cheeks, looking absolutely terrified. She reached out her hands, trembling, trying to grab his jacket. Kendrick, please. Isabella begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. You are my husband. You have to fix this. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell Jocelyn to give us the money back. We can go to Paris and forget all about this. Please do not leave me with nothing. Kendrick looked down at the woman he had once loved. His expression was devoid of any affection. He calmly opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He dropped it directly into her lap. Those are the divorce papers, Isabella. Kendrick stated, his tone completely flat. I signed them this morning. My lawyers have already filed the preliminary injunctions to completely sever our finances. You will not get a single cent of my savings or my investments. You drained your brother company dry, and you tried to drag my credit score down with you to fund your delusions. Our marriage is over. You can keep the fake designer bags, but I am taking the house. Isabella let out a sharp, devastated wail, burying her face in her hands as the envelope slid off her lap and hit the floor. Nathaniel watched his sister collapse and let out a vicious, bitter laugh. You think you are so smart, Kendrick? He sneered, stepping forward with renewed venom. You think you can just walk away from the Blackwell family after orchestrating this disaster? I still have friends in this city. I still know the board members at your firm. First thing tomorrow morning, I am making a phone call to your managing director. I will tell them you violated non-disclosure agreements and conspired to orchestrate a hostile takeover against a client. You will be fired before lunch. I will make sure you are blacklisted from every single financial institution in this country. You will never work in this industry again. Kendrick paused, turning slowly to face Nathaniel one last time. A genuine, relaxed smile spread across his face, completely disarming Nathaniel's rage. Save your breath, Nathaniel, Kendrick replied smoothly. I already handed in my resignation letter to my firm 2 days ago. I do not work for them anymore. Nathaniel frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. Then who the hell do you work for? Kendrick buttoned his suit jacket and walked over to stand right beside me and Carmen, aligning himself perfectly with the new ownership of Vanguard Heritage Holdings. I just accepted a highly lucrative position as the Senior Vice President of Risk Management, Kendrick announced, gesturing toward me. I work for Jocelyn now, and my first official recommendation as her new VP is to immediately liquidate your remaining assets. Nathaniel's legs gave out completely. He collapsed into his chair, staring blankly at the ruined dining table. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The golden boy of the Blackwell family, the untouchable financial prodigy, had just been checkmated by his own brother-in-law. The sheer, absolute finality of Kendrick's declaration hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Isabella was weeping uncontrollably, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her scalp as the reality of her impending divorce and financial ruin finally took hold. Richard's face was a canvas of pure apoplectic fury. The patriarch of the family, the man who had controlled every narrative and crushed every opponent, was watching his empire burn to the ground in a single evening. He opened his mouth to unleash another barrage of threats, but a sudden sharp sound interrupted him. A wineglass shattered against the hardwood floor. Everyone turned their attention toward the far end of the long dining table. Aunt Brenda stood there, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany surface so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Tears streamed freely down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She was shaking visibly, trembling under the weight of a secret she had carried for far too many decades. Brenda had sat quietly through all the family dinners, all the holidays, all the moments where my mother and father had viciously torn me down. She had remained a silent, complicit bystander out of fear. But watching the absolute destruction of her brother lies had finally broken her. "I cannot do this anymore," Brenda cried out, her voice cracking with raw, unrestrained emotion. "I cannot sit here and watch you lie to this girl for another second, Richard. The game is over. It is all over." Patricia spun around, her eyes widening in sheer panic. "Brenda, sit down and shut your mouth," Patricia hissed venomously. "You have had too much to drink. You are making a fool of yourself." "I am not drunk," Brenda shouted back, her tears flowing faster now. "I am finally completely sober. For 15 years I have watched you two treat Jocelyn like she was dirt on your shoes. I watched you call her ugly. I watched you call her plain. I watched you tell her she lacked the intellect and the charisma to be a true Blackwell. I let you convince her she was the family failure." Brenda took a shaky step forward, bypassing Patricia and walking directly toward me. She stopped a few feet away, looking at me with a mixture of profound sorrow and desperate awe. "They did not hate you because you were plain, Jocelyn," Brenda said, her voice softening into a painful whisper. "They hated you because every time they looked at you, they saw her. You are the absolute spitting image of your grandmother Eleanor." The mention of my late grandmother sent a visible shockwave through my father. Richard stepped back, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Keep my mother out of this," Richard barked, his voice laced with sudden frantic fear. "I will do no such thing," Brenda snapped, glaring at her brother with deep disgust. Eleanor was the only person in this family who actually understood what legacy meant. She did not care about cheap commercial real estate or liquidating assets for a quick payday. She cared about architectural preservation. She cared about history. She spent her entire life protecting the historic properties of this city. And she despised you, Richard, because she knew exactly what you were. She knew you were a greedy, short-sighted developer who would gladly bulldoze a century of history to build a hideous glass skyscraper just to stroke your own ego. Brenda turned her attention back to me, her eyes shining with tears. "Eleanor watched you growing up, Jocelyn. She watched you sitting in the corner reading those heavy architectural digest books while Isabella was playing with makeup. She watched you admire the structural integrity of the old buildings downtown. Eleanor knew that business was not a man world. She knew it was a world for the passionate and the brilliant. She knew you were the only person in this bloodline smart enough and strong enough to protect the Blackwell Empire." Patricia let out a desperate, high-pitched scream. "Stop talking, Brenda. Do not say another word." But Brenda ignored her, completely feeding off the adrenaline of the truth. Eleanor knew that the moment she died, Richard would completely destroy the historic districts for cheap commercial gain. Brenda continued, her voice ringing clear and loud across the dining room. So she did something drastically brilliant. She bypassed Richard entirely. She went to her private attorneys behind his back. Eleanor did not leave the core estate to your father, Jocelyn. She secretly left the true master deeds to the entire original family estate directly to you. The room went dead silent. The jazz music had long since stopped playing, leaving only the sound of Brenda heavy breathing and the collective shock of the remaining guests. My mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what she had just revealed. The master deeds, the foundation of the entire Blackwell fortune. It was mine. It had always been mine. They were absolutely terrified of you, Jocelyn, Brenda confessed, wiping a tear from her cheek. They realized that if you ever found out about the master deeds, you would have the ultimate legal authority to shut down Richard Commercial Development Firm. You could stop his hostile takeovers. You could freeze his demolition projects. So they devised a sickening plan. They decided to break your spirit. They isolated you. They made you the scapegoat. They constantly told you that you were ugly and worthless, so you would never develop the confidence to ask questions. They stole your trust fund and threw you out into the street because they needed you as far away from the family attorneys as possible. They erased you from the family so they could illegally control your inheritance. You miserable lying traitor, Richard roared, his voice booming like thunder. My father lunged forward, shoving past Patricia and Nathaniel. He looked like a madman, his perfectly groomed hair completely disheveled, his eyes wide with frantic, psychotic desperation. He refused to accept defeat. He refused to let an emotional confession strip him of the empire he had stolen. You think a crying woman and a sob story changes the law? Richard screamed, pointing a furious finger at me. You think I would ever let my mother hand my legacy over to a weak little girl? I am the patriarch of this family. I control the real estate in this city. Richard reached a shaking hand into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He frantically dug around before pulling out a folded, heavily yellowed piece of paper. The parchment looked ancient, the edges frayed and delicate. He held it high above his head, waving it around like a weapon of ultimate destruction. Eleanor was a senile old fool. Richard spat, his voice echoing with absolute malice. She tried to go behind my back, but I was always one step ahead. You want to talk about master deeds. You want to talk about true ownership. This right here proves that everything Brenda just said is entirely legally irrelevant. This proves I am the sole owner of the grandfather estate. You get nothing, Jocelyn. You will always get nothing. Richard's chest heaved with exertion, his eyes wide with a manic, triumphant gleam, as he thrust the yellowed paper into the air. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to fall to my knees, the way my mother Patricia was currently weeping onto the expensive carpet. He expected the same terrified submission he had beaten into this family for decades. I did not blink. I simply picked up my crystal water goblet, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back onto the linen tablecloth with a soft clink. The absolute silence from my end of the table seemed to unnerve him more than if I had started screaming. Is that the best you can do, Richard? I asked, my voice echoing with a chilling, lethal calm. A piece of distressed parchment you have been carrying around like a shield. If you are so entirely confident in the absolute legitimacy of that document, I suggest we make this a matter of public legal record right here and right now. I gestured casually toward the adjacent booth. Sitting just a few feet away, completely captivated by the spectacular implosion of the Blackwell family, was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was not just a senior board member of the country club. He was a retired state Supreme Court judge and one of the most senior notary publics in the entire state. He had been quietly sipping his scotch, watching the entire confrontation unfold, with the sharp, analytical eyes of a man who had spent 40 years on the bench. Arthur, I called out, projecting my voice across the silent dining room. I apologize for interrupting your evening, but since my father is waving around a supposedly historic legal document, would you do us the profound honor of authenticating it? Arthur placed his scotch glass down. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and stood up, adjusting his tailored blazer. "It would be my distinct pleasure, Jocelyn," he replied, stepping over to our table with the slow, measured gait of a man who knew the law better than anyone in the room. Richard puffed out his chest, his arrogant smirk returning with full force. He believed he had won. He believed his money and his power had bought him a forgery so perfect that it could withstand any scrutiny. He aggressively closed the distance between himself and Arthur, slamming the yellowed piece of paper down onto the center of the dining table. "Examine it closely, Arthur," Richard demanded, his voice dripping with venomous pride. "Look at the signature. Look at the date. Look at the official state seal. It is completely flawless. My father signed this estate over to me on his deathbed because he knew I was the only one capable of multiplying our wealth. He knew women had no place running a commercial empire." Richard turned his back on the notary and pointed directly at me. "I want the doors to this club locked immediately," Richard shouted, barking orders at the trembling country club manager hovering near the kitchen entrance. "Call the police right now. I want this ungrateful, treacherous girl arrested for corporate fraud. I want her arrested for attempting to steal my estate and for forging whatever fake acquisition papers she brought here tonight. You are going to prison, Jocelyn. You are going to rot in a cell while I tear down every single historic building your pathetic grandmother tried to save." Arthur pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his nose. He leaned over the table, examining the grand, sweeping signature at the bottom of the page. The room held its collective breath. Isabella stopped sobbing. Nathaniel stared wide-eyed. Even Brenda clutched the edge of the table, praying her confession had not been in vain. "The signature appears to be an exact match to your late father, Richard," Arthur murmured, squinting at the faded ink. "The dates align perfectly with the timeline of his passing. The paper itself feels authentic to the period. Visually speaking, it is a remarkably convincing master deed." Richard threw his head back and let out a booming, arrogant laugh. "Of course it is authentic, you old fool," Richard gloated, pacing like a victorious gladiator. "I am a Blackwell. I do not make mistakes. I hold the power in this city, and nobody takes what is mine. Now get the authorities in here and put her in handcuffs." I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had shown all evening. It was a cold, calculated smile that made my father's victorious laughter die in his throat. "Visual authentication is a wonderful thing, Arthur," I said, stepping out from behind my chair and walking slowly toward the center of the table. "But at Vanguard Heritage Holdings, we do not deal in visual assumptions. We specialize in historic preservation, which means we also specialize in the forensic analysis of historic documents. Carmen, if you would be so kind." Carmen, sleek and professional, stepped forward immediately. She placed her leather briefcase onto the table right next to Richard's supposedly authentic deed. She unlatched the brass locks with a sharp click. She reached inside and pulled out a heavy-duty cylindrical flashlight. It was not a standard light. It was a high-grade ultraviolet forensic scanner used by top-tier corporate auditors to detect tampering in physical contracts. "What is this nonsense?" Richard sneered, his face flushing with a sudden prickle of anxiety. "Get that toy away from my property." Carmen ignored him completely. She powered on the device. A harsh, vibrant violet beam shot out of the lens, illuminating the dark mahogany table. Authentic legal documents from that specific era were printed on high-rag content paper. Carmen explained, her voice loud and clear, carrying the weight of a seasoned corporate shark. They possess specific fiber structures, but more importantly, any master deed processed through the state legal system in the late 1990s required an embedded security watermark from a bonded paper manufacturer. Carmen swept the violent ultraviolet beam directly over the center of Richard yellowed parchment. The room gasped in unison. Under the harsh glow of the UV light, a bright fluorescent blue emblem suddenly materialized deep within the fibers of the supposedly ancient paper. It was a crisp, modern corporate logo, featuring a stylized mountain peak with bold block lettering underneath. I looked directly into my father's terrified, bulging eyes. "That is a beautiful watermark, Richard," I whispered, leaning over the table so my face was inches from his. It belongs to Apex Millennium Paper Incorporated. They are a highly exclusive boutique paper manufacturer based out of Switzerland. They make fantastic tamper-proof parchment for high-end corporate contracts. Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. There is just one tiny microscopic problem with your flawless master deed. Richard the First, continued my voice rising in power and volume, pinning him to the wall. Apex Millennium Paper was founded in the year 2018. My grandfather died in 2008. I picked up the forged document holding the glowing blue watermark up for the entire country club to see. You forged a document on paper manufactured 10 years after the man who supposedly signed it was already dead. I declared, dropping the fraudulent deed onto the floor, right at his expensive Italian loafers. You are right about one thing, Father. The police are definitely coming tonight. But I am not the one leaving this room in handcuffs. The reality of his impending imprisonment finally pierced through Nathaniel's thick skull. He stared at the glowing blue watermark on the fraudulent deed, and then his eyes snapped wildly toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room. But he knew he could not outrun a high-level corporate fraud investigation. His only option in his panicked, feral state of mind was to destroy the physical evidence. With a guttural, desperate yell, Nathaniel lunged across the massive mahogany dining table. He knocked over crystal water goblets and smashed plates of expensive catered food, sending fine china crashing to the hardwood floor. His manicured hands clawed desperately at the forged piece of paper, trying to snatch it, crumple it, or swallow it if he had to. He never even got his fingers on the document. Arthur moved with a lethal, terrifying speed that completely defied his age and his tailored country club blazer. He stepped forward, intercepted Nathaniel's outstretched wrist, and twisted it sharply. Nathaniel let out a high-pitched shriek of pain as Arthur seamlessly spun him around and slammed him face first into the dining table. Arthur pinned Nathaniel's arm painfully high behind his back, pressing his knee into the small of the golden boy, back holding him completely immobilized among the spilled wine and broken glass. "Get off my son!" Richard bellowed, taking a threatening step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I will have you stripped of your club membership, Arthur. I will sue you for assault. I will ruin you." Arthur did not even flinch. He reached into his breast pocket with his free hand, but he did not pull out a country club membership card or a notary stamp. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and flipped it open, letting a heavy silver shield catch the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. "I am afraid my club membership is the least of your concerns," Richard Arthur stated, his voice vibrating with absolute lethal authority. "I am Special Agent Arthur Pendleton with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Real Estate Fraud Task Force. And you are both currently interfering with an active federal investigation." The blood drained from Richard's face so fast, he looked as though he might physically collapse. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a chair, grabbing his chest as if he could physically stop his heart from pounding out of his ribcage. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting frantically around the room as the socialite facade she had maintained for decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "He is a federal agent!" Isabella whimpered, pressing her back against the wall, her knees trembling violently. "You brought a federal agent to family dinner." "I brought the exact person required to witness a felony," I replied, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my dress. "You see, Richard, I knew about the forged master deed months ago. I knew you paid a shadow broker $500,000 to mock up a fake document that would allow you to bypass my grandmother legally binding trust. I knew you planned to present it tonight to publicly humiliate me and steal Vanguard Heritage Holdings. But I also knew that if I confronted you in private, you would just burn the evidence and pay off another set of corrupt lawyers to tie me up in litigation for the next decade." I took a slow, victorious lap around the destroyed dining table, walking right past my mother, who was shaking too hard to even look at me. "I needed you to feel powerful," I explained, my voice perfectly calm, contrasting beautifully with the absolute chaos I had orchestrated. "I needed you to feel so arrogant, so completely untouchable, that you would willingly pull out the forged document in a room full of witnesses. I needed you to hand it directly to a federal investigator of your own free will. You practically begged to be arrested. You built your own prison cell tonight, Richard. I just provided the lock and key. This is entrapment. Nathaniel sobbed. His cheek pressed hard against the wet, polished wood of the table, his arms still pinned painfully behind his back. This is illegal. You set us up. We are the Blackwells. You cannot do this to us. Actually, Nathaniel, Arthur replied, pressing his knee just a fraction of an inch deeper into my brother's back, causing another pathetic yelp. It is only entrapment if law enforcement coerces you into committing a crime you were not already predisposed to commit. You commissioned the forgery. You carried it into this building. You presented it as fact to steal a multi-billion-dollar estate. I was simply sitting at the next table enjoying my scotch. Arthur reached around to his belt and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the silent room, sending a fresh wave of horror through my family. He quickly secured Nathaniel's wrists together, lifting the once proud golden boy off the table and shoving him roughly into a nearby chair. Nathaniel slumped forward, weeping openly, his expensive suit stained with spilled wine and his own tears. Arthur turned his cold, calculating gaze toward my father. Richard Blackwell, you have the right to remain silent. Arthur began, his voice carrying the rhythmic, devastating cadence of the Miranda warning. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Wait. The single word cut through the air, stopping Arthur mid-sentence. I held up my hand, stepping between the federal investigator and the man who had spent 35 years making me feel like an ugly, worthless burden. Arthur paused, glancing at me with a questioning look, but he lowered his hand, stepping back to give me the floor. He knew the deal we had struck. He knew I needed this final moment before the authorities officially took over. Richard looked at me, his eyes swimming with a mixture of hatred, terror, and a desperate, pathetic pleading. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to offer me money or power or whatever hollow currency he thought could buy his freedom now that his entire world had collapsed. Do not put the handcuffs on him yet, Arthur, I commanded, staring directly into my father's soul, watching the last embers of his arrogant empire burn away into nothing. I am not finished with them yet. Arthur stepped back, his hand resting casually near his federal badge, giving me the floor. He understood the assignment. He understood that before the law took its course, the family debts needed to be settled in full. Richard's chest heaved. Sweat poured down his face, pooling in the deep wrinkles around his eyes. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Carmen. He looked at the shattered wine glass on the floor. The walls of his meticulously curated reality were closing in, but the arrogance of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life refused to die quietly. He wiped his face with a trembling hand and let out a harsh, jagged laugh. You think this is over, Jocelyn? Richard wheezed, leaning his heavy frame against the mahogany table. You think a federal agent and a revoked deed mean you have won. You are exactly like your grandmother. You live in a fantasy world. You live in the past. But I live in the present. I live in the dirt and the concrete and the steel. Richard pushed himself up, his eyes manic and wild. He pointed a finger toward the massive windows overlooking the city skyline. You might have cornered the paperwork, Richard spat, but I still control the heavy machinery. Nathaniel Commercial Firm still holds the active ground leases. We still hold the municipal demolition permits. My bulldozers are staged at the historic downtown district right now. I have 50 men standing by waiting for my signal. We are going to raze those blocks to the ground tonight. He paced back and forth, his voice growing louder, more unhinged. By tomorrow morning, those decrepit brick buildings will be nothing but a cloud of dust. You cannot preserve a pile of rubble, Jocelyn. You cannot save a legacy that has been crushed into gravel. Once the land is cleared, the city will be forced to rezone it for commercial development. I will build my strip mall. I will build my luxury condos. I will generate enough cash to tie you up in litigation until you are completely bankrupt. He believed in the wrecking ball. He believed in the brute force of commercial destruction. He believed that erasing the past was the only way to secure his future. He believed that if he broke the physical foundation of my inheritance, he would break me. I looked at him with profound, unadulterated pity. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, chaotic energy. I simply stood my ground and let the silence stretch until it began to suffocate him. You never bothered to look up what Vanguard Heritage Holdings actually does, Richard Weiss said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal resonance. You saw the word holdings and your greed filled in the blanks. You assumed we were just another predatory equity firm. You assumed we were exactly like you. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. We are not corporate developers, I explained. We are heritage conservators. Vanguard is one of the largest and most aggressive historical preservation trusts on the eastern seaboard. And I have not just been buying up your toxic debt for the last 6 months. I have been cataloging every single brick. I have been measuring every single cornerstone. I have been documenting every single architectural anomaly in that downtown district. Richard Manick's smile began to falter. A new kind of terror crept into his eyes. I submitted the architectural significance reports to the State Historic Preservation Office back in October. I continued, my voice relentless and rhythmic. I submitted the structural integrity assessments in November. I submitted the complete urban heritage portfolio in December. I submitted the proof of my grandmother vision. I submitted the evidence of the district irreplaceable cultural value. I submitted everything you tried so desperately to hide in the shadows. Suddenly, a harsh electronic buzzing shattered the tension in the room. It was Nathaniel's smartphone vibrating violently on the polished wood where he had dropped it earlier. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the spilled wine. The caller ID flashed brightly in bold letters. It read, Site Foreman, Downtown. Nathaniel squirmed against Arthur's grip, his face still pressed hard against the table. Let me answer it. Nathaniel begged, his voice muffled by the wood. Dad, tell him to let me answer it. Answer it for him, Carmen. I instructed, never taking my eyes off Richard. Carmen stepped forward gracefully. She picked up the vibrating phone, swiped the screen to accept the call, and activated the speakerphone, turning the volume up to maximum. Mr. Blackwell? A panicked, breathless voice echoed through the quiet dining room. Mr. Blackwell, are you there? We have a massive problem. Nathaniel craned his neck, straining against the federal agent hold. What is it? Nathaniel yelled. Start the engines. Knock those buildings down right now. Break the foundations. I cannot do that, sir. The foreman shouted, his voice barely audible over the piercing wail of distant sirens. The machines are completely shut down. We are completely surrounded. State police cruisers just blocked off every single intersection. There are federal marshals physically chaining the perimeter gates shut. Richard gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Tell them you have the municipal permits, Richard bellowed, leaning toward the speakerphone. Tell them we have the legal right to demolish the site. Show them the paperwork. They do not care about our municipal permits, sir, the foreman cried out, his voice cracking with pure panic. The marshals just handed me a federal injunction. They drew their weapons, sir. They said if anyone on this crew touches so much as a single brick on these properties, they are going straight to federal prison. The line went dead with a sharp, heavy click. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at my father and my brother, watching the final realization of their total defeat wash over their faces. Their bulldozers were dead. Their development plans were dead. Their arrogant empire was dead. Those properties are no longer zoned for commercial development, Richard stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the entire downtown district has been officially declared a protected federal historical landmark. You touch my grandmother buildings and you will share a cell with your son. Richard collapsed into his chair as if his strings had been suddenly violently cut. His jaw hung slack, his eyes vacant and glassy. The reality of the federal injunction was the final fatal blow to his ego. He had spent his entire life bulldozing over people's laws and historical legacies. Now he was nothing more than a broken old man sitting in a country club staring at the smoking ruins of his stolen empire. Nathaniel let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the chair where Arthur had secured him. His designer suit was ruined. His wrists were bound in heavy steel, and his future was entirely confined to a federal penitentiary. The golden boy of the Blackwell family had been utterly neutralized. But a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. Isabella stared at her husband in handcuffs. She looked at her father, who was hyperventilating in his seat. The realization washed over her in a cold, brutal wave. The trust fund was gone. The commercial real estate firm was going to be seized by the government. The private jets, the designer wardrobes, the exclusive vacations, they were all evaporating right in front of her eyes. She was about to lose her wealth, her status, and her freedom. Her weeping stopped abruptly. The tears dried up, replaced by a sudden frantic venom. Isabella stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She dug her hand into her expensive designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. Her fingers flew across the screen, her perfectly manicured nails tapping with a desperate manic energy. "You think you have won, Jocelyn!" Isabella shrieked, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You think you can just waltz in here and take my life away? You think you can put my husband in a cage and leave me with nothing?" I looked at her, completely unbothered. "I am not taking your life away, Isabella," I replied smoothly. "I am simply reclaiming what was stolen from me." Isabella let out a high-pitched, hysterical laugh. She marched around the table, holding her phone out like a weapon. "You run a publicly traded company now," Isabella sneered, her eyes wide with psychotic desperation. "Vanguard Heritage Holdings relies on a pristine corporate image. Your shareholders expect perfection. Your board of directors expects absolute ethical transparency. What do you think happens to your stock price when the entire world sees the truth about their precious CEO?" She shoved the screen toward my face. I did not flinch, but I glanced at the display. It was a series of highly compromising photographs. They depicted me, or rather a digital manipulation of me, engaged in highly illegal narcotics transactions and scandalous situations that would instantly destroy any corporate career. The deepfakes were incredibly well rendered. The lighting, the shadows, the facial expressions, they were flawless. "I have over 5 million followers across my social media platforms," Isabella gloated, her voice dripping with pure malice. "I have direct lines to every major gossip outlet and financial blog in the country. It only takes one tap, Jocelyn. One tap. And these photos go completely viral. Your board will force you to resign by morning. Your investors will pull out. Your stock will absolutely plummet. You will be a pariah in the corporate world." Patricia suddenly sprang to her feet, her face flushed with a sickening, triumphant glee. The maternal mask she had worn for years completely melted away, revealing the ugly, toxic core underneath. "Do it, Isabella!" Patricia screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Post them right now. Destroy the ungrateful brat. Show the world what a disgusting failure she really is. She deserves to lose everything. She deserves to be ruined. Press send, Isabella. Ruin her." A mother actively cheering for the total public destruction of her own daughter. It was a staggering display of depravity, but it no longer hurt me. I was immune to their poison. I simply shook my head, pitying the absolute pathetic nature of their desperation. Isabella hovered her finger over the screen, a cruel, victorious smirk twisting her face. "Hand over the master deeds," Isabella demanded, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "Call off the federal agents, transfer control of Vanguard back to my father, or I press send and your entire life burns to the ground." I did not move. I did not speak. I simply stepped aside. Kendrick moved forward. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his expression completely devoid of emotion. As my senior vice president of risk management, Kendrick did not just handle financial threats. He handled every conceivable danger to the company. And he was absolutely ruthless. He held a sleek titanium tablet in his left hand. He did not shout, he did not argue. He simply tapped a single button on his screen. Immediately, the giant OLED smart televisions mounted on the country club walls switched from the evening sports broadcast to a stark black screen. The entire dining room watched as lines of digital code bank transfer receipts and server logs began scrolling rapidly across the massive displays. "Digital extortion is a fascinating crime," Isabella Kendrick stated, his voice slicing through the dining room with forensic precision. "Amateurs always believe the internet provides anonymity, but on the web, nothing is truly hidden, not if you know where to look." Isabella's smirk faltered. She looked at the screens, her confusion rapidly transforming into pure terror. "What is that?" Isabella stammered, taking a step backward. "What are you doing?" "I am doing my job," Kendrick replied coldly. Vanguard Heritage Holdings employs some of the most aggressive cybersecurity experts in the private sector. The moment you uploaded those deepfakes to a cloud server preparing to distribute them, our network detected the threat. We did not just block the files, we traced them. Kendrick tapped his tablet again. The screen zoomed in on a specific IP address, highlighting a wire transfer receipt from an offshore account. We traced the original metadata right back to a notorious hacker collective operating out of Eastern Europe, Kendrick explained, pointing to the highlighted text on the screen. We traced the encrypted communications, but more importantly, Isabella, we traced the money. Patricia stopped cheering. The color drained from her face as she looked at the bank routing numbers displayed on the television. "You paid the hacker $20,000 to create those fraudulent images," Kendrick announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "But you did not use your own money, Isabella. You are broke. Your credit cards are maxed out. You used funds routed directly from a shell account linked to Nathaniel Commercial Real Estate Firm. You used embezzled corporate money to fund a cyber extortion campaign against the CEO of a publicly traded company." Isabella dropped her phone. The device clattered against the hardwood floor screen, cracking instantly. Her knees buckled and she grabbed the back of a chair to keep from collapsing completely. "Do not press send, Isabella," I whispered, stepping close enough so only she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. Because the moment our cybersecurity team verified the wire transfer, Kendrick forwarded the entire packet of metadata, the IP addresses, and the financial receipts directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division. Kendrick pocketed his tablet, looking down at Isabella with cold, detached efficiency. "They are already waiting for you outside the country club," Isabella Kendrick informed her. "You are facing 20 years for corporate espionage and federal cyber extortion. Have a pleasant evening." Isabella let out a sound that was half gasp and half choke as the reality of her impending federal indictment crushed the air from her lungs. She stared blankly at the shattered remains of her phone on the floor and then slumped into the nearest chair, her meticulously styled hair falling over her face in a curtain of total defeat. The reigning socialite of the city had been utterly dismantled by a single tap on a screen. With Nathaniel handcuffed against the dining table, Richard hyperventilating in the corner, and Isabella paralyzed by the promise of 2 decades in federal prison, the impenetrable fortress of the Blackwell family had been reduced to ash. Only Patricia remained. My mother stood frozen, her eyes darting between the ruined members of her family. The vicious, triumphant glee that had animated her face just moments prior completely evaporated. She had spent her entire adult life hiding behind the power of her husband and the cruel arrogance of her favored children. Now those shields were entirely gone. She was exposed. She was alone. And she was staring directly at the daughter she had gleefully tried to destroy. The transition was instantaneous and deeply sickening. The malicious matriarch vanished, and in her place appeared a terrified, trembling old woman. Patricia's legs gave way. She did not gracefully take a seat. She dropped heavily to her knees, her expensive designer dress pooling around her on the dining room floor amidst the broken glass and spilled wine. The sheer indignity of her posture would have horrified her under normal circumstances, but survival had completely overridden her vanity. "Jocelyn," she whimpered, her voice cracking as tears began to carve tracks through her heavy makeup. "My sweet Jocelyn, you cannot do this. Please, you have to stop this right now." I looked down at her. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering desire for maternal affection. The well of my empathy for this woman had run completely dry years ago. "You are my daughter!" Patricia wept, crawling forward an inch on the hardwood floor, her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. "We are blood, Jocelyn. Blood is thicker than water. I carried you. I raised you. You could never send your own mother to jail. You have a good heart. You have always had such a good, forgiving heart. You cannot destroy your own family." I stared at the woman who had just commanded my sister to ruin my life. She was weeping over the consequences of her own actions, trying to weaponize the very biological connection she had spent 15 years treating like a disease. "Do not invoke biology," Patricia Wise stated, my voice flat and devoid of a single ounce of warmth. "You forfeited the right to call yourself my mother the day you packed my belongings in garbage bags and changed the locks on the front door. You forfeited it every time you called me ugly. You forfeited it every time you praised Nathaniel for his greed and applauded Isabella for her cruelty. You were cheering for my total destruction 30 seconds ago. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you care about me now." Patricia let out a loud, wailing sob, reaching her hands out as if hoping to grasp my ankles. I took a slow, deliberate step back. "But we had to be hard on you," Patricia babbled frantically, her mind scrambling for any possible justification. "We wanted to make you strong. We wanted to prepare you for the real world. We made mistakes, Jocelyn, but we are still your family. We owe each other forgiveness." "We do not owe each other anything," I replied, my tone shifting from cold detachment to sharp corporate efficiency. "However, you do owe me a considerable amount of money." I snapped my fingers without looking away from my mother. Carmen moved instantly. She reached into the depths of her leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy, thick black ledger. It was bound in premium leather and embossed with the Vanguard Heritage Holdings corporate logo. Carmen handed it to me. I weighed it in my hands for a brief second before dropping it directly onto the polished floor. I nudged it with the toe of my shoe, sliding the heavy book across the hardwood until it bumped gently against Patricia's knees. Patricia stared down at the black book as if it were a live explosive. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling violently. "That is an itemized invoice," I explained, crossing my arms and looking down at her. "I am a businesswoman, Patricia. I deal in debts and assets and in ledgers. Since you are so keen on discussing what we owe each other, I decided to calculate the exact mathematical cost of being your daughter." Patricia hesitated, her hands hovering over the leather cover. "Open it," I commanded. With shaking fingers, she peeled open the heavy cover. Her eyes widened as they landed on the first page, which was filled with densely packed financial spreadsheets, accounting logs, and highlighted numerical figures. "Let us review the accounting," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent dining room. "The first item is my college trust fund, the one my grandfather set up for me before he passed. You and Richard illegally drained that account the day I turned 18, using a corrupt family lawyer to bypass the age restrictions. You stole exactly $150,000 to pay for Isabella lavish destination wedding." Patricia swallowed hard, a fresh tear dropping onto the pristine paper. "If you look at column B, you will see that I have adjusted that stolen amount for inflation," I continued relentlessly. "I have also applied the standard compound interest rate of the SP 500 over the last 15 years. That alone comes to over $600,000. But that is just the beginning. Turn the page." Patricia blindly obeyed, her hands shaking so severely she nearly tore the heavy paper. "The next section covers the stolen inheritance," I stated. "The dividends from the commercial properties that were legally mine. The rent you collected on buildings I owned. The legal fees I incurred just trying to survive while you actively blacklisted me from every design firm in the city. And finally, we reach the emotional damages." Patricia gasped, staring at the bold red number printed at the bottom of the final page. "I calculated the premium corporate rate for 15 years of active psychological warfare," I explained coldly. "I billed you for every therapy session. I billed you for the trauma. I billed you for the sabotage, the trauma. I billed you for the sabotage. I billed you for the sheer exhausting cost of sharing your last name. The total outstanding balance you owe me is $32,400,000, and it is payable immediately." Patricia stared at the staggering number, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Her mind, already fractured by the collapse of her family, completely broke under the weight of the undeniable mathematical proof of her crimes. She looked at me, her eyes wide with genuine hysteria. "We do not have it!" she shrieked, her voice breaking into a manic panic. "We do not have $32 million, Jocelyn. You took the company. The federal agents are taking the real estate. We are ruined. We have nothing left to give you. Then you will liquidate your personal assets, I replied smoothly. You will sell the cars, the jewelry, the designer clothes, and this ridiculous country club membership. You do not understand, Patricia wailed, waving her hands frantically slapping the ledger. You think we took your trust fund because we were greedy. You think we stole the rent money just to be cruel. We were desperate, Jocelyn. Richard made terrible investments. The commercial firm was bleeding money for years. We had to take your money. We had to take everything we could get our hands on. She was completely unraveling her sense of self-preservation, entirely obliterated by the panic. She forgot where she was. She forgot who was listening. She forgot about the federal investigator standing less than 10 feet away. We had to take your inheritance, Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. We needed the liquidity. We needed the cash. We had to feed the secret offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, or the international auditors would have found out we were completely insolvent. The echo of the words Cayman Islands hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating truth that instantly changed the entire trajectory of the evening. Arthur Pendleton did not miss a single beat. He smoothly reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored blazer and produced a small leather-bound notebook along with a heavy silver pen. An offshore account, you say? Arthur noted, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a surgical scalpel. In the Cayman Islands, to hide insolvency from international auditors. That is a truly fascinating admission, Patricia. I believe the Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network will be highly interested in tracking the exact routing numbers for those hidden funds. Patricia clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes bulging as she realized the catastrophic magnitude of what she had just screamed. She had just confessed to international money laundering and corporate tax evasion in a room actively occupied by a federal investigator. The absolute terror of self-incrimination completely paralyzed her. She looked frantically from Arthur to Jocelyn, and finally to her husband, seeking some kind of salvation that no longer existed. Richard was no longer just a defeated businessman. He was a cornered apex predator whose final escape route had just been incinerated by his own wife. The offshore accounts were his absolute last resort. They were the hidden, untraceable millions he had meticulously siphoned away over decades of corrupt real estate deals, illegal kickbacks, and hostile corporate takeovers. They were his lifeline, his golden parachute, and his absolute guarantee that even if his domestic commercial empire fell to pieces, he would still live the rest of his life like a king on a private beach. And Patricia had just handed the treasure map directly to the federal government. Something primal and utterly unhinged snapped behind Richard's eyes. His face contorted into a mask of pure feral rage. The thick veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his expensive silk collar. He let out a guttural roar that did not even sound human, stripping away the last remaining veneer of his aristocratic sophistication. "You stupid, pathetic woman," Richard screamed, his voice tearing through the dining room with violent acoustic force. He lunged across the open space separating them. He did not care about the federal agent standing right there taking notes. He did not care about the country club management watching in horror from the kitchen doors. He did not care about the Blackwell legacy or the pristine public image he had spent half a century ruthlessly protecting. He only cared that Patricia had single-handedly destroyed his only safety net. Richard grabbed his wife by the shoulders, his large, heavy hands digging viciously into the delicate silk fabric of her designer dress. He yanked her up from the floor with brute force and shook her with a terrifying, violent intensity. Patricia shrieked in raw terror, her arms flailing wildly as her husband shook her back and forth, snapping her head dangerously. "Shut your mouth!" Richard roared, spraying spit across her terrified, tear-stained face. "Shut your mouth right now! You are ruining everything! You are giving them everything! I told you to never mention those offshore accounts to anyone. I told you to take that secret to the grave. You have doomed us both." Patricia sobbed uncontrollably, trying to push his massive chest away, but his grip was like industrial iron. "Richard, let go of me," she wailed, her pristine socialite facade completely obliterated, replaced by the panicked survival instinct of a cornered animal. "You are hurting me! Richard, please stop! You are hurting me!" The Golden family, the untouchable Blackwell dynasty, had completely descended into a violent, primitive brawl right on the hardwood floor of the most exclusive country club in the state. Isabella let out a high-pitched, hysterical scream, scrambling backward away from her parents, knocking her heavy wooden chair over in her frantic rush to escape the sudden domestic violence. Nathaniel, still handcuffed and pinned in his seat by his own predicament, could only watch in wide-eyed silent horror as his father violently assaulted his mother. Brenda covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face, as the toxic, rotting core of her brother marriage was finally laid bare for the entire world to see. "You incompetent fool," Richard bellowed, giving Patricia another violent shake that sent her expensive pearl necklace snapping. The heavy white beads scattered and bounced across the hardwood floor, sounding like hailstones. Those accounts were our survival. They were the only thing keeping us out of a federal penitentiary when the auditors finally looked at the books. And you handed them to a Fed on a silver platter because you could not control your hysterical emotions. I should have left you decades ago. You are nothing but a massive liability. "I did this for you," Patricia shrieked back, her survival instinct finally overriding her physical fear as she aggressively clawed at his hands. "I lied for you every single day. I covered up your massive financial failures for 30 years. I sat at these stupid dinners and smiled while you stole from your own daughter college fund to cover your bad bets. Do not you dare put this on me, Richard. You are the one who bankrupted the commercial firm. You are the one who engaged in wire fraud. You are the one who forged a dead woman's signature tonight." Every single word they screamed at each other was another nail driven into their collective coffin. Arthur was writing furiously in his notebook, his pen flying across the paper documenting every spontaneous, legally binding confession of wire fraud, embezzlement, and international tax evasion. They were doing the prosecution job for the federal government. They were tearing each other apart in their pathetic desperation to shift the blame. I watched the spectacle with absolute zero emotion. I did not feel the sudden urge to intervene and protect the woman who had birthed me. I did not feel the urge to calm the man whose surname I unfortunately shared. They were complete strangers to me. They were just two corrupt, hostile entities, consuming each other in a raging fire of their own making. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid and professional, observing the destruction of the Blackwell name with the clinical cold detachment of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt ledger. "I will kill you!" Richard seethed, his face purple with rage, raising a heavy hand as if he were actually about to strike his wife across the face. "I will absolutely destroy you before I let you put me behind bars." That was the absolute limit. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers, a single sharp cracking sound that cut through the shouting. The response was instantaneous. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room did not just open, they burst inward. A highly coordinated team of 6 private security operatives clad in dark, tailored suits swarmed into the room with terrifying military precision. These were not standard country club bouncers. These were Vanguard Heritage Holdings' elite corporate protection unit, highly trained professionals who handled high-threat executive extractions. They moved silently, swiftly, and with overwhelming physical force. 2 operatives bypassed the screaming Isabella and the handcuffed Nathaniel, entirely zeroing in directly on Richard. Before my father could even register their sudden presence or bring his raised hand down upon my mother, they struck. One operative grabbed Richard, raised arm, twisting it sharply downward into a painful lock, while the other hit him squarely in the back of the knees. Richard let out a stunned, breathless grunt as his legs buckled completely under him. The operatives hauled him backward effortlessly, ripping him away from Patricia. They slammed him face down onto the center of the long dining table. His jaw struck the mahogany surface with a sickening thud, landing right amidst the shattered crystal water goblets and the pooled expensive red wine. The jagged edges of the broken glass bit into his tailored suit as the operatives pinned his arms brutally behind his back, pressing his face firmly into the exact mess he had created. Richard's face was mashed against the wet mahogany, his heavy breathing fogging the polished wood. The security operatives held him in absolute stasis, their grips like industrial iron. Patricia remained frozen on her knees, her hands trembling as she stared at her neutralized husband. The king and queen of the Blackwell Empire were completely broken. The crown had fallen, and in the vacuum of their sudden collapse, the two remaining heirs turned feral. Nathaniel twisted violently in his chair, his steel handcuffs clinking against the heavy wooden frame. His perfectly groomed facade melted into a mask of ugly, terrified rage. He stopped looking at his ruined parents and locked his manic eyes directly on Isabella. "You did this!" Nathaniel spat, his voice cracking with panic. "You completely destroyed us, Isabella. You and your psychotic spending bled my firm completely dry." Isabella stepped back, her face pale as Nathaniel's words struck her. "You think I wanted to embezzle money to cover your ridiculous debts?" Nathaniel yelled, struggling against his restraints. "You demanded private jets for weekend shopping trips in Paris. You demanded the summer house in the Hamptons. You demanded a multi-million-dollar wedding that drained our reserves. You completely drained the corporate accounts to fund your pathetic, empty socialite lifestyle. We had to access those illegal offshore accounts because of you. We had to commit federal fraud because you could not stop buying designer garbage to impress people who do not even like you. If you had just controlled your pathetic greed, none of this would be happening right now." Isabella's face contorted from shock into pure venomous hatred. The veins in her neck stood out as she pointed a shaking finger at her brother. "Do not, you dare put your massive failures on me!" Isabella shrieked, her voice echoing sharply across the dining room. "My lifestyle did not bankrupt your firm, Nathaniel. Your absolute incompetence bankrupted the firm. You are a pathetic businessman who only got the CEO title because Dad handed it to you on a silver platter. You never earned a single thing in your entire life. You made terrible investments," Isabella screamed, pacing back and forth like a caged predator. "You bought toxic commercial properties that sat empty for years. You signed disastrous lease agreements that trapped the company in massive debt. You lost our 3 biggest municipal contracts in a single quarter because you were too busy playing golf at this stupid country club to read the actual proposals. You lost tens of millions of dollars because you are stupid, Nathaniel. You have always been incredibly stupid. You just hid behind dad money and blamed everyone else when your idiotic schemes completely collapsed." The perfect Blackwell sibling bond was officially dead. The glossy magazine covers, the unified holiday portraits, the mutual arrogance they shared, all of it burned away in an instant. They were screaming their darkest, deepest resentments at the top of their lungs, stripping away the fake unity to reveal the toxic competition that had always defined them. Patricia watched them from her knees, her hands covering her face, sobbing uncontrollably as the 2 children she had worshipped tore each other to pieces. Richard turned his head against the glass-covered mahogany, squeezing his eyes shut against the humiliating spectacle. "I always hated you," Nathaniel bellowed, his face red and sweating profusely. "You are a shallow, empty parasite. You contributed absolutely nothing to this family but expenses and scandals. I carried the entire legacy on my shoulders while you did nothing but spend my hard-earned money. I worked 18-hour days trying to keep this family afloat while you were busy taking vacations." "You carried nothing," Isabella countered, laughing hysterically, her makeup running down her face. "You drove the legacy straight into a brick wall. Mom and Dad always covered for your massive failures. They bailed you out every single time you ruined a project because you were the precious golden boy. They robbed Jocelyn Trust Fund to pay for my wedding, but they robbed the entire corporate treasury to hide your massive financial blunders. You are the reason we are going to federal prison, Nathaniel. You are the one who authorized the wire transfers." They continued to tear each other apart, barking and snarling like starving dogs fighting over a scrap of meat. They blamed each other for the bankruptcy. They blamed each other for the fraud. They blamed each other for the total destruction of the Blackwell name. I let them scream for a few minutes. I let them exhaust their lungs and expose the absolute rot at the core of their sibling dynamic. I let the federal agents and the security team witness exactly how quickly these arrogant elites turned into cowardly scavengers when faced with actual consequences. Then I decided it was time to end the debate. "Enough," I said. I did not raise my voice, but the quiet, lethal authority in my tone immediately silenced the room. Isabella clamped her mouth shut, panting heavily, her chest heaving with exertion. Nathaniel stopped struggling against his handcuffs, slumping back into his wooden chair. Even Richard stopped groaning against the wet table. Every eye in the dining room locked onto me. "You are both operating under a massive delusion," I stated slowly, walking toward the center of the room. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, measuring the absolute silence. "You are tearing each other apart over a fundamental misunderstanding of your own failure." I stopped and looked directly at my brother. "Isabella, massive spending did not bankrupt your commercial real estate firm, Nathaniel." I explained, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "Her designer bags and private jets were a drop in the bucket compared to your massive operating budget. She is completely reckless with money, but she is not the reason you went insolvent. She did not drain the corporate accounts." I turned my cold gaze to my sister. "And Nathaniel, idiotic investments did not bring the company down either." "Isabella," I continued, "he certainly made mistakes, but the market always allowed him to recover in the past. He did not lose those massive municipal contracts because he was playing golf. He lost them for a very specific reason." Nathaniel stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with a sudden dreadful realization. The panic in his expression shifted into something much deeper. "What are you talking about?" Nathaniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "You went bankrupt, Nathaniel, because I wanted you to go bankrupt." I stated, my voice cold and absolute. "I did not just start Vanguard Heritage Holdings 6 months ago. I have been building my firm in the shadows for years. And for the last 36 months, I have systematically dismantled your empire piece by piece." I walked closer to him, leaning over the table. "Every time you submitted a bid for a lucrative municipal contract, my firm submitted a better one," I explained, watching the devastating truth wash over his face. "Every time you tried to acquire prime commercial real estate, my shell companies outmaneuvered you and bought the land first. When you tried to secure vital supply chain routes for your construction materials, I bought out the exact suppliers you relied on and immediately canceled your contracts. I squeezed your liquidity until you could barely make payroll. I legally, invisibly suffocated your business. I analyzed your entire corporate strategy. I continued relentless and unforgiving. I anticipated your every move. I exploited your outdated business models. I blocked your access to crucial capital. I drove your profit margins into the absolute ground. I forced you into a corner where your only option for survival was to illegally access those offshore Cayman accounts. I orchestrated your financial ruin from the shadows while you were busy taking the credit for a legacy you never truly earned." Nathaniel shook his head slowly, unable to process the magnitude of the revelation. "You did not fail, Nathaniel," I whispered, delivering the final crushing blow. "You were defeated. I broke your company with my own 2 hands, just so you would become desperate enough to commit the exact fraud that is putting you in a federal cell today." Nathaniel stared at me, his jaw working silently as he tried to formulate a response that simply did not exist. The absolute certainty of his own brilliance, the lie he had been fed since childhood, shattered behind his eyes. He looked back over the last 3 years of his life. He replayed every lost bid, every mysterious supply chain failure, every prime real estate parcel snatched out from under him at the 11th hour. He had blamed the economy. He had blamed shifting municipal politics. He had blamed his own junior executives. He had never once suspected that the invisible hand crushing his throat belonged to the sister he had so casually discarded. His chest heaved, and a pathetic whimper escaped his throat. The golden boy, the heir apparent to the Blackwell dynasty, was completely and utterly broken. I turned away from him, dismissing his existence entirely. I looked at the security operatives holding my father down against the ruined dining table. "Let him up," I instructed, my voice calm and authoritative. The operatives instantly complied, hauling Richard backward and shoving him roughly into a heavy leather chair. Richard slumped sideways, gasping for air. A dark, bruised cut had opened on his lower lip from the impact against the mahogany. Thick drops of blood trickled down his chin, staining his pristine white collar, and pooling on his expensive silk tie. He looked like a beaten warlord breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room, in a frantic search for an exit that had already been sealed. I took my place at the head of the table, assuming the position my father had occupied for decades. I looked at the ruined remnants of my family, Patricia weeping on the floor, Isabella trembling in sheer terror, Nathaniel handcuffed and catatonic, Richard bleeding and disoriented. "We have reached the end of the line," I announced, the acoustics of the private dining room amplifying the absolute finality of my words. "The illusions are over. The embezzlement, the extortion, the forged signatures, and the secret offshore accounts are entirely exposed. You have exactly one move left to make." I snapped my fingers without looking away from them. Carmen stepped forward, carrying a thick stack of legal folios bound in heavy navy blue cardstock. She moved around the table with predatory grace, placing one folio in front of Nathaniel, one in front of Isabella, and the final one directly in front of Richard. "Open them," I commanded. Nathaniel's hands shook violently as he awkwardly flipped the cover open despite the heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists. Isabella leaned forward, her tear-streaked face pale as she read the bold black text printed on the first page. Richard simply stared at the document, breathing heavily through his nose, his chest rising and falling with jagged, irregular rhythms. "What you are looking at is a master buyout agreement," I explained, my voice echoing with corporate precision. "It is a legally binding, immediate, and irrevocable transfer of ownership. By signing those documents, you are surrendering 100% of your shares in the Blackwell commercial real estate firm. You are surrendering the family trust. You are surrendering the deeds to the residential properties, the vehicles, the private accounts, and the Cayman Island offshore funds. You are relinquishing every single asset you possess to Vanguard Heritage Holdings." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I retrieved a single crisp $1 bill. I smoothed it out and placed it perfectly in the center of the ruined dining table, right next to a shattered crystal goblet. "That is your purchase price," I stated. $1 for everything." Isabella let out a horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. "You are taking everything," she sobbed, her voice muffled by her fingers. "You are leaving us on the street." "I am leaving you with a choice, Isabella," I corrected her sharply. "Right now, Agent Pendleton has enough evidence to put every single one of you in federal prison. Nathaniel and Richard are facing decades for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and international tax evasion. You and Patricia are facing 20 years for federal cyber extortion and conspiracy. If you refuse to sign those documents, the cuffs stay on. The FBI raids your homes tonight. Your assets are seized by the government, and you spend the rest of your natural lives rotting in concrete cells." I paused, letting the sheer, terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence settle heavily over the room. "But if you sign," I continued, my tone shifting into a cold, transactional cadence, "I will ask Agent Pendleton to stand down. I will instruct my cybersecurity team to permanently delete the tracking data linking you to the Eastern European hackers. Vanguard will absorb the toxic debt and handle the municipal fallout. You will walk out of this country club tonight with nothing but the clothes on your backs, but you will walk out as free citizens." Patricia scrambled forward on her knees, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Sign it, Richard," she begged hysterically, her voice cracking into a shrill shriek. "Sign the papers. I am not going to jail. I cannot go to jail, Jocelyn, please. Richard, sign the documents. We can start over. We can figure something out. Just sign it." Nathaniel looked at the pen resting beside the folio. His arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, cowardly desire for self-preservation. He awkwardly maneuvered his cuffed hands, reaching for the silver pen. "I will sign," Nathaniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Just keep me out of prison, Jocelyn. I will give you everything. Just let me walk away." He gripped the pen and moved it toward the signature line. "No," Richard roared, his voice tearing through the room like a sudden, violent explosion. Richard lunged sideways, ignoring the security guards. He slapped Nathaniel's hands away, sending the silver pen clattering across the hardwood floor. Richard pushed himself up from his chair, his chest heaving, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Blood dripped from his split lips, splattering onto the legal documents. He leaned across the table, glaring at me with a hatred so deep it seemed to radiate from his very bones. He gathered the saliva in his mouth and spat a thick wad of blood directly onto the toes of my designer shoes. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked down at the blood on my shoe and then back up into his manic eyes. "You think you are so smart?" Richard sneered, his voice wet and jagged. "You think a bunch of federal agents and some fancy paperwork can take down my empire? You forgot one very important detail, Jocelyn. I do not play by federal rules. I own the state." Richard reached into his trousers, ignoring the sudden movement of the security operatives who tensed behind him. He pulled out his smartphone, his thumb quickly swiping across the cracked screen. "I have been paying off Judge Marcus Vance for 25 years, Richard boasted, his voice echoing with desperate manic triumph. "He sits on the state Supreme Court. He owes me his entire career. One phone call, Jocelyn. That is all it takes. I will have Vance issue an emergency judicial injunction against Vanguard Heritage Holdings before midnight. He will freeze your assets. He will invalidate these ridiculous contracts. He will issue a warrant for your arrest for corporate terrorism and illegal surveillance. You are not taking my company, you ungrateful little witch. I am burying you." Richard slammed his bloody thumb against the glass screen of his phone, activating the speakerphone option with a violent swipe. He held the device high in the air like a weapon, his chest heaving as the digital dial tone began to ring. The sound was loud, hollow, and sharp, slicing through the thick, suffocating silence of the private dining room. "Listen to it!" Richard sneered, his voice dripping with venomous confidence as blood leaked from his split lip onto his knuckles. "Listen to the sound of your execution, Jocelyn. You thought you could audit me. You thought you could back me into a corner with your little navy blue folders. You forgot who built this city. You forgot who bought the courts. You forgot that the Blackwell name dictates the law in this state." He stared at the phone, his eyes wild and unfocused as the tone went through its first long ring. He needed the judge to answer. He needed his power back. He needed his absolute authority restored. He needed to prove to everyone in this room that he was still the untouchable patriarch who could dismantle an investigation with a single late-night connection. Patricia looked up from the floor, her tear-stained face suddenly frozen. A pathetic spark of desperate hope ignited in her eyes as she watched her husband hold the device. Nathaniel stopped staring at his handcuffs, his posture straightening slightly as the ringing filled the room. They had seen Richard pull off miracles before. They had seen him bribe politicians, threaten independent auditors, and erase massive corporate scandals with a single phone call. To them, Judge Marcus Vance was the ultimate shield. He was the untouchable vanguard of the Blackwell family corruption. He was their final guarantee that no matter how deep the rot went, they would never face a day of actual accountability. Arthur Pendleton did not look up from his notebook. His silver pen continued to slide smoothly across the paper, recording every word Richard yelled. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, my expression completely unreadable, as the second ring echoed through the dining room. The phone clicked. The ringing stopped. Richard's face contorted into a triumphant grin, his mouth opening to bark his commands down the line. He was ready to demand an immediate emergency injunction. He was ready to order the arrest of everyone standing in his way. But the voice that responded was not the booming, aristocratic tone of Judge Marcus Vance. It was a sterile, mechanical, pre-recorded, automated female voice that cut through the speaker with absolute clinical detachment. "We are sorry," the automated voice announced, the sound flat and digital. "The number you are trying to reach has been restricted and disconnected by order of the United States District Court and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This line is subject to an active federal intercept and a grand jury probe. If you believe you have reached this line in error, hang up immediately. All communications on this network are currently being monitored for criminal prosecution." The mechanical recording stopped. A harsh, steady, busy signal filled the room, sounding like a flatlining heart monitor. Richard froze, his arm remaining suspended in the air. The words echoed out of the small phone speaker, flat, mechanical, and devastating. "The number has been restricted. The line is subject to a federal intercept." The judge did not answer. The judge was not going to answer. The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's thumb pressed the red button, his breathing turning shallow and ragged. He dialed again. He slammed his bloody thumb against the glass screen, redialing the exact same digits with frantic, panicked speed. The phone rang once. "We are sorry," the automated voice played again, its tone completely identical to the first. "The number you are trying to reach has been restricted and disconnected." He hung up and dialed a third time. His fingers smeared blood across the glass as he frantically tapped the keys. "We are sorry," the automated voice repeated. The repetition was brutal. It was a mechanical loop of absolute systemic failure. Every time the recording played, another layer of the Blackwell defense was completely stripped away. Patricia let out a low, broken moan, sinking back onto her heels, her final sliver of hope completely incinerated. Nathaniel's jaw dropped, his eyes wide with a blank catatonic terror as he realized the safety net had been entirely removed. The Supreme Court shield was gone. The judicial protection was gone. The illusion of their invincibility was gone. Carmen stepped forward, her movements perfectly fluid and entirely detached from the escalating panic. She bypassed the frozen Isabella and leaned down over the mahogany table, her shadow falling directly across Richard's bleeding face. She tilted her head, her voice a quiet, lethal whisper that cut straight through his manic denial. "He is not going to answer." "Richard," Carmen whispered, her voice smooth and devoid of any mercy. "Vanguard Heritage Holdings does not just audit corrupt commercial real estate firms. We audit the public servants who protect them." She tapped the screen of her tablet, bringing up a secure corporate directory. "Last month, our forensic accounting division finalized the deep dive investigation into Judge Vance's entire real estate kickback network." Carmen explained, her words cold and relentless. "We mapped every illegal wire transfer, every hidden land parcel, and every corrupt judicial favor he traded with your firm over the last 2 decades. The complete compliance ledger and transaction history were finalized in our internal database weeks ago." Carmen swiped her finger across the screen, displaying a series of heavily encrypted data folders. The files detailing his bribes are fully documented under the secure digital entries labeled Duyen Mao 1_23.docx, Duyen Mao 2_23.docx, Duyen Mao 3_23.docx, and Duyen Mao 4_24.docx. Every single one of those files was handed directly to the Department of Justice Forensic Unit 24 hours before we stepped into this country club tonight. She leaned in closer, her cold eyes locking onto my father's terrified gaze. "Judge Marcus Vance was taken into custody at his private residence at dawn," Carmen stated flatly. "He is not issuing an emergency injunction for you, Richard. He is currently sitting in a federal holding cell waiting for his own arraignment. You are completely alone." The final realization hit Richard like a physical blow. The phone slipped from his bloody fingers, clattering against the wood and sliding directly into the pool of spilled red wine. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute finality of his defeat completely paralyzed him. His empire, his properties, his freedom, everything had been legally and invisibly dismantled before he even realized the war had begun. And then the silence of the country club hills was shattered. In the far distance, a faint, high-pitched wail broke through the night air. It was a sound Richard had spent 50 years buying his way out of. The wailing grew louder, transforming into a synchronized, deafening chorus of police sirens. They were approaching, fast, roaring up the winding private driveway of the club. The harsh, rhythmic red and blue flashing lights began to bleed through the heavy velvet drapes, painting the white walls of the dining room in a flashing crimson warning. The wail of the sirens grew deafening, tearing through the pristine acoustics of the exclusive country club. The red and blue lights strobed violently across Richard's face, illuminating the absolute terror, completely replacing his aristocratic rage. He was entirely out of options. The federal authorities were not just investigating, they were arriving in overwhelming force. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoing down the grand marble hallway outside our private dining room signaled the definitive end of an era. Richard scrambled backward away from the mahogany table, his eyes darting frantically like a trapped animal. He looked at Patricia, who was huddled on the floor, entirely useless to him now, her socialite status offering zero protection against a federal raid. He looked at Isabella, who was sobbing hysterically, gripping her ruined designer dress. Then his panicked, desperate gaze locked onto his only son. The transition from dominating patriarch to cowardly scavenger was instantaneous and utterly pathetic. Richard lunged across the open space separating him from Nathaniel, ignoring the Vanguard security operative standing just feet away. He grabbed the lapels of his son's expensive tailored jacket with his bloody, trembling hands, hauling Nathaniel partially out of his heavy wooden chair. The steel handcuffs biting into Nathaniel's wrists clinked loudly as he was jerked forward. Richard pulled him close, his breath ragged and smelling of stale wine and metallic copper from his bleeding lip. "You have to take the fall, Nathaniel." Richard hissed, his voice a desperate, manic whisper that cut sharply through the approaching sirens. "You are the CEO of the commercial firm. Your name is on the operating agreements. You have to tell the federal agents you did this entirely alone." Nathaniel stared at his father in absolute paralyzed horror. The golden boy, the designated heir, the son who had spent his entire life desperately craving this man, toxic approval, was finally seeing the true face of his idol. Richard was not a titan of industry. He was a coward willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to save his own skin. "I cannot take the fall for this." Nathaniel stammered, his eyes wide with profound betrayal. "Dad, you orchestrated the offshore transfers. You ordered me to move the funds to the Cayman Islands. You physically forced me to sign those specific ledgers last week. I will spend 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Richard shook him violently, snapping his head back with brutal force. "You are young." Richard spat, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure self-preservation. "You can serve a decade and bounce back. I am 70 years old. I will die in a concrete cell. You owe me this, Nathaniel. I built this entire empire for you. I paid for your lifestyle. I gave you everything. You are going to look that federal agent in the eye, and you are going to confess that you initiated the Cayman Island transfers completely without my knowledge. You will say you forged my signature on the authorization forms to cover your own bad commercial investments." Isabella gasped from across the room, her tears temporarily stopping as she witnessed the ultimate betrayal. Patricia covered her ears, refusing to listen as her husband actively tried to destroy their son. Arthur Pendleton simply stood in the corner, his pen flying across his notebook, documenting the spontaneous conspiracy happening right in front of him. The sirens cut off abruptly outside, leaving only the chaotic shouting of federal agents swarming the club lobby, securing the perimeter. Time was entirely up. Nathaniel realized in that exact moment that the Blackwell legacy was a complete toxic lie. His father was actively throwing him to the wolves to buy himself a sliver of reasonable doubt in federal court. Nathaniel stopped struggling against his father's grip. His expression shifted from panicked disbelief to a cold, terrifying clarity. He lowered his gaze to his handcuffed wrists, resting awkwardly against his lap. His fingers brushed against the smooth glass face of his expensive smartwatch. With a subtle, deliberate tap of his index finger, Nathaniel activated the emergency audio recording application. A tiny red indicator light blinked on the digital screen, completely hidden from his father's frantic view. "Say you will do it," Richard demanded, gripping Nathaniel's jacket tighter, shaking him again. "Tell them I had absolutely nothing to do with the embezzlement. Tell them the offshore accounts were your sole creation. Confirm it right now before they breach those double doors." "You ordered the wire fraud?" Dad Nathaniel asked loudly, ensuring his voice projected perfectly toward his own wrist, capturing the audio clearly. "You want me to tell them I forged your name on the Cayman Island routing documents even though you personally executed those transfers last Tuesday?" "Keep your voice down, you incompetent idiot," Richard hissed, shoving him roughly back into the chair. "Yes, that is exactly what you are going to do. You are going to take the full blame for the wire fraud I committed because you are the reason this family is ruined. You owe me your freedom." Nathaniel let out a dry, hollow laugh. He looked past his father and met my eyes across the room. The golden boy had finally learned how to play the game in the mud. Nathaniel smoothly unclasped the smartwatch from his wrist, allowing it to drop heavily onto the mahogany table. With a quick push of his bound hands, he slid the digital timepiece straight across the polished wood. It glided past the spilled wine and stopped perfectly right next to the crisp $1 bill I had placed there earlier. The tiny red recording light was still blinking, capturing every single damning word Richard had just spoken. "I have the entire confession," Nathaniel stated, his voice steady and completely devoid of the familial loyalty that had chained him for 30 years. He explicitly admitted to orchestrating the wire fraud and executing the offshore transfers. He just admitted to coercing me into a false confession to obstruct a federal investigation. Nathaniel locked his eyes onto mine completely, ignoring his father's stunned, horrified expression. The heavy footsteps of the federal agents halted right outside the private dining room. They were seconds away from kicking the doors off their hinges. "I will give you the unedited audio file," Jocelyn Nathaniel begged, his voice dropping into a desperate, calculated plea for survival. "I will testify against him in open court. I will hand the Department of Justice the exact routing numbers he used for the Cayman accounts. I will give you his head on a silver platter. Just give me immunity." I stared down at the expensive piece of technology resting next to my single crisp dollar bill. The tiny red recording light blinked steadily, a digital heartbeat pulsing with Nathaniel's pathetic desperation. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, genuinely believing he had just executed a masterstroke of self-preservation. He actually thought he could buy his way out of the slaughterhouse by offering me the very meat I was already butchering. I reached out and picked up the smartwatch. The metal casing was still warm from his wrist. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the heavy, polished weight of it while analyzing the sheer cowardice radiating from my brother. Nathaniel leaned forward against his steel cuffs, his breath catching in his throat. He waited for his salvation. I opened my hand. The watch dropped, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, loud crack. Before Nathaniel could even register the movement, I brought the razor-thin heel of my stiletto down directly onto the glass face. The crunch of shattering crystal and snapping microchips echoed violently in the room. I ground my heel into the device, twisting my foot with absolute precision until the tiny red recording light flickered and died completely. Nathaniel let out a strangled gasp, his face draining of all color. "I do not make deals with traitors, Nathaniel," I stated, my voice dropping to a glacial, unforgiving whisper. "You would sell your own father to save your own skin, and you would sell me the exact same way the second it suited your interests. Your leverage is garbage. I already have everything I need." The perimeter breached. Before Nathaniel could process the destruction of his only bargaining chip, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room were violently shoved open. The federal agents did not enter alone. A tactical squad of heavily armed local police officers stormed into the room, their heavy boots thundering against the floorboards. The local chief of police walked in right behind them, his face a mask of absolute grim authority. He bypassed the terrified country club management entirely and locked eyes with Agent Pendleton, giving a sharp professional nod. "The perimeter is fully secured," the chief announced, his voice booming across the dining space. "We have units blocking every exit and a federal transport van waiting out front." The sudden, overwhelming presence of uniformed police officers instantly vaporized the last remaining fumes of the Blackwell family arrogance. The flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars outside washed through the tall dining room windows, casting eerie, moving shadows across the mahogany table. It was no longer an abstract corporate threat of audits or financial ruin. It was entirely physical. It was immediate. It was the visceral reality of handcuffs holding cells and the total loss of liberty. Patricia let out a high-pitched wail, curling into a tight ball on the hardwood floor. Her pristine socialite facade was entirely gone, replaced by raw animal panic. Richard slumped back in his leather chair, staring blankly at the police officers. The blood from his split lip continued to drip steadily onto his expensive silk tie, but he did not even try to wipe it away. His eyes were completely hollow. The untouchable titan of industry had been reduced to a trembling, empty shell. The absolute surrender. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the stack of navy blue folios resting on the table. "The clock has officially run out," I announced, my voice cutting sharply through Patricia, hysterical sobbing. You have exactly 30 seconds to sign these buyout agreements. If my pen does not hit that paper by the time I finish counting, the chief of police is going to read you your Miranda rights and parade you through the main lobby of this exclusive country club in handcuffs. I picked up the heavy silver pen from the floor where Richard had slapped it away earlier. I wiped it deliberately on a clean cloth napkin and placed it directly in front of my father. "Sign it, Richard," I commanded. Richard's hands shook violently as he reached for the pen. He did not look at me. He did not look at his weeping wife or his terrified children. He simply stared at the signature line on the Vanguard Heritage Holdings contract. With a jagged, trembling motion, he dragged the pen across the paper, signing away the commercial empire he had spent 50 years ruthlessly building. He signed away the prime properties, the family trust, the legacy, and his absolute authority. He surrendered everything for a single dollar bill. He pushed the folio away, letting his head fall back against the chair in total defeat. I slid the next folio toward Patricia. She scrambled up from the floor, grasping the edge of the table to steady her shaking legs. She did not even read the terms. She snatched the pen from her husband and signed her name with frantic, sloppy strokes, her tears splashing directly onto the legal document. Nathaniel was next. The Vanguard security operative temporarily loosened his right handcuff, just enough to give him mobility. Nathaniel grabbed the pen, holding it like a lifeline. He signed his name to the corporate transfer agreement, officially handing me complete control of the commercial firm he had driven into the ground. The final severance. Isabella sat frozen, staring at her brother as he passed the silver pen to her. She looked at the blue folio containing her personal financial ruin. She was losing her trust fund, her platinum credit cards, and her access to the elite social circles she desperately craved. "I am not doing this," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with stubborn denial. "You cannot take my money, Jocelyn. My husband is a senior partner at a major law firm. Kendrick will absolutely destroy you in court." A tall figure stepped out from the shadows behind the line of police officers. Kendrick moved into the harsh light of the dining room, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. He did not look at Isabella with the adoration of a supportive husband. He looked at her with clinical, detached disgust. Kendrick walked straight to the table and dropped a thick manila folder directly on top of the Vanguard buyout agreement. "I will not be representing you," Isabella Kendrick stated, his voice perfectly flat and professional. "Vanguard Heritage Holdings acquired my law firm 3 days ago. Jocelyn is my new majority shareholder, and she was gracious enough to provide me with the complete forensic audit of your personal spending habits." Isabella's face registered absolute catastrophic shock. Kendrick tapped the manila folder. "Those are divorce papers," Kendrick continued coldly. "You have illegally siphoned over $4 million from our joint accounts to cover your secret debts and your fraudulent charity events. You will sign Jocelyn buyout agreement to clear your federal extortion charges, and then you will immediately sign these divorce papers waiving any right to alimony or spousal support. If you refuse, I will personally hand the financial records to the district attorney and watch you go to prison for embezzlement." Isabella let out a shattered, breathless gasp. Trapped between a federal prison sentence and total social annihilation, she finally broke. Her hands shaking uncontrollably, she picked up the silver pen. She signed the Vanguard contract, surrendering her shares. Then, sobbing loudly, she signed the divorce papers, permanently severing her last tie to wealth and status. The verdict. The entire Blackwell empire had just been legally transferred to my name for exactly $4. I gathered the 4 navy blue folios, stacking them with precise, methodical care. I handed the stack to Carmen, who stood silently at my side, observing the carnage. "Verify the signatures," I instructed. Carmen quickly flipped through the pages, checking the wet ink against the strict legal requirements. She closed the final folio and gave me a sharp, confirming nod. The assets, the properties, the holding companies, and the offshore accounts were officially mine. The hostile takeover was absolutely complete. I turned away from the table, leaving my ruined family sitting in the wreckage of their own making. Richard let out a long, ragged sigh of relief, wiping the blood from his chin, believing he had just bought his freedom. Patricia stopped crying, slumping against the mahogany. They actually thought they had survived. I walked directly over to the chief of police and Agent Pendleton, who were waiting by the doorway with their handcuffs ready. I looked at the chief, my expression perfectly calm. "The contracts are signed," I stated clearly, ensuring my voice carried across the silent room. I smiled a cold, sharp blade of a smile. "Arrest them anyway for the offshore tax evasion." The room erupted into sheer pandemonium the exact second the command left my lips. The local police officers and federal agents surged forward in perfect synchronization, executing a sweep that had been meticulously coordinated long before I even stepped foot inside the country club. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the sudden violent protests of the Blackwell family. Richard fought back with the desperate flailing strength of a trapped animal. He shoved a federal agent attempting to twist away from the heavy hands gripping his tailored suit jacket, but two more officers immediately tackled him against the ruined mahogany table. His face was slammed directly next to the crisp $1 bill and the shattered remains of Nathaniel's smartwatch. He twisted his neck to look at me, his eyes bulging with a hatred so absolute it bordered on madness. He cursed my name, spitting blood and vitriol, screaming that he would destroy me from inside a federal cell. The police chief simply leaned over him, reciting the Miranda rights, in a booming, authoritative voice that completely drowned out my pathetic threats. "You have the right to remain silent," the chief barked, hauling Richard upright and securing the cuffs tightly behind his back. "I highly suggest you finally use it." Patricia let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling wail. She scrambled across the hardwood floor on her hands and knees, ignoring the spilled red wine soaking into her expensive couture gown. She reached out her hands, grasping frantically at the empty air between us, begging for mercy. "Jocelyn, please," she shrieked, her voice cracking into a jagged sob. "We gave you everything. You took the company. You took the houses. You promised we would walk away. I am your mother. Please do not let them put me in a cage." A female officer firmly grabbed Patricia by the arms, pulling her away and reciting her rights. Patricia's legs gave out entirely, forcing the officers to practically drag her dead weight toward the exit. She wept uncontrollably, her pristine socialite facade entirely obliterated, leaving behind only a terrified, desperate criminal facing decades of harsh reality. Nathaniel offered zero resistance. The golden boy of the Blackwell dynasty, the arrogant heir who had believed his own intelligence was unmatched, looked completely hollowed out. He stood up slowly, offering his wrist to the federal agent. He looked at the crushed smartwatch under my stiletto and realized the profound depth of his own foolishness. He had betrayed his father to save himself, only to discover that I held every single card on the board. His shoulders slumped, his chin resting on his chest in utter crushing defeat. He did not say a single word as they marched him out the door, his spirit completely broken by the sheer magnitude of his failure. Isabella remained stranded on the floor, the absolute picture of solitary ruin. She was entirely untouched by the police because her crimes were strictly financial and heavily tied to Kendrick's upcoming civil litigation. She clutched the signed divorce papers to her chest, her diamond rings flashing under the harsh strobe of the police lights outside. Her luxury silk dress was stained and torn, her perfect makeup ruined by rivers of mascara. She looked up at Kendrick, begging him with her eyes for a single ounce of the affection he had once feigned. Kendrick simply adjusted his suit jacket, his expression carved from stone, and deliberately turned his back on her. Isabella buried her face in her hands, sobbing with a ragged, gasping sound. She was entirely penniless, devoid of any social standing, and completely alone. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, watching them being frog-marched out of the exclusive private dining room one by one. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not hurl insults or offer any grand parting speeches. I simply let the silence of my victory wash over the room. A terrified country club waiter, trembling from head to toe, slowly approached the table, carrying a silver tray. He offered me a fresh flute of champagne, his eyes averted in sheer terror. I took the glass with a polite nod. I raised the crystal rim to my lips and took a slow, calm sip. The crisp, chilled liquid slid down my throat, tasting like absolute unadulterated freedom. I looked at the empty chairs, the spilled wine, the abandoned designer jackets, and the scattered legal folios. The heavy, crushing weight I had carried since childhood dissolved completely. The years of being dismissed as the ugly one, the outcast, the family scapegoat, who would never amount to anything, evaporated into the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the courtyard. They had spent decades trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me that I was a worthless disappointment. They had built an empire on fraud and arrogance while actively trying to crush my spirit. Now their empire belonged to me, and they belonged to the federal penal system. The slate was permanently wiped clean. I turned away from the tragic spectacle on the floor and faced the only two people in the room who actually mattered. Carmen stood holding the thick stack of signed buyout contracts securely against her side, her posture radiating lethal efficiency. Kendrick stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his eyes reflecting a deep, calculating intelligence. They were not family by blood, but they were the family I had chosen. They were the architects of my vanguard. I walked over to them, raising my champagne flute. Kendrick picked up a glass from the serving tray, and Carmen mirrored the gesture, taking one for herself. To the successful acquisition of the Blackwell portfolio, I said, my voice steady and ringing with quiet authority. And to the newest member of the Vanguard Heritage Holdings Executive Board, welcome to the team, Kendrick. Kendrick smiled, a sharp, genuine expression of predatory satisfaction. It is an absolute privilege, Jocelyn. I look forward to auditing the rest of the Eastern Seaboard with you. Carmen nodded, her dark eyes gleaming with anticipation. The transfer documents will be filed with the state before midnight, she confirmed. The properties are officially secure. We clinked our crystal glasses together, the sharp chiming sound ringing like a bell of absolute victory. I took one final sip of the champagne and set the empty glass down on the ruined mahogany table. I did not look back at Isabella, who was still weeping silently on the floor. I did not look out the window at the police cruisers hauling my parents and brother away into the dark night. Let us go, I instructed, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. We have a multi-million-dollar heritage acquisition in Boston to finalize by tomorrow morning, and I refuse to be late. I turned my back on the flashing police lights, stepping out of the private dining room and walking purposefully down the grand marble hallway. Kendrick and Carmen flanked me, moving with the synchronized grace of apex predators. We walked out of the country club, leaving the ashes of my toxic family firmly in the past, stepping forward into an empire entirely of my own making. The greatest deception toxic families use is convincing you that your worth is tied to their approval. Jocelyn's victory was not just about seizing an empire, it was about reclaiming her narrative. When the people meant to protect you choose to exploit you, instead your ultimate weapon is your own quiet, relentless growth. True power is never inherited, it is forged in the fires of being underestimated. Surround yourself with loyalty, you choose not toxicity you are born into. Share your story of walking away from a toxic environment to build your own empire below, and please remember to hit subscribe.